Hey everybody, welcome to the live stream. I am not here today. Well, I am here today, but not here for only for a couple minutes. I'm going to hand it off to Bill, and we're going to have a great show. So we'll see you tomorrow. All right, take it away, Bill.
Bye, Alex. Have a great day. And everybody, welcome to Office Hours. For those of you who have been here before, and I know that many of you have, we talk about technology. And we basically have an interesting show because this show, unlike anything else you're going to see or hear on the internets or whatever, is run by you. You become the producers of this show, and you do so by typing questions into our question system. And then depending on the votes those questions get from everybody watching, your topic might end up being the star of the show. And what that means is basically you start by going to YouTube, where many of you I know are probably watching, and that link will get you to a Zoom meeting, which is what you're watching right now. If you post in the comments on the Zoom, or if you look in the comments, just click on the chat in the Zoom meeting, you will find another link to a service called Mukana. And that is something Alex has developed that handles our questions. And basically you can type any question you'd like that's tech related. We ask you please to keep things short and concise because it gets a little overwhelming to read small novels as questions. And then when your question goes in, everybody who's in the system can see it and vote on it. And basically the way the show runs, the questions that get the most votes are what we talk about the longest and discuss in more detail. So please vote, please ask questions. And if you do that, we will have, as we have, I think almost every day here, a really fascinating discussion about all sorts of technology issues. And they span the gamut. We have networking questions, we have video questions, we have audio questions, really anything to do with producing technology-based programming or discussing the technology solutions that people use, particularly in this fast changing world where everything that we used to do is kind of in flux, and we have these new shows like the one you're watching now. So that's the overview. I believe that my friend Guy down there in the panel is going to handle question management for today. And so if we're ready, Guy, do you want to go ahead and take it away?
Let's fire off with the first one. The first one's coming in from Doug Ferguson in Fort Wayne, Indiana. And he says, when running a webinar and the session ends, is there a quick way to remove all the attendees and keep the panelists on for some wrap up?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Who amongst the panel today do a lot of that kind of running webinars and things like that? We don't have some of our usual suspects. Often we have people who do tons of this, but I'm not seeing any hands waving. So, Talak and Jeffrey will get in on this. So Talak, let's go with you first.
One solution is to use Zoom OSC and then make a do an action by role and say attendees, and then have them all leave at once in that way.
So if you're not familiar with Zoom OSC, that's something created by a company called Liminal and a friend of ours, Andy Carluccio, who's been in the panel a lot explaining the process. And it's a front end that makes Zoom meetings more flexible and gives you a lot more control over them. Jeffrey, do you have another set of solutions?
The only other way is just basically go in, and once everybody leaves, if there's any lingering people that you don't want, you can just go in and say remove. And that takes them out of the webinar. They can't come back in until the next webinar happens. So that's the only other way without a third-party option.
Do people who do this a lot, do you still find that transition zone from going to the announcement and the full panel down to something smaller and more directed to be a kind of a hitch in the process? Is it still less than easy, Jeffrey?
Yeah, that's what we did last night. We had to kick like 300 people out in. I mean, Jeffrey, I know you love clickety click, but man, I didn't like clickety click last night.
I don't like clickety click. I want easy too. That's yeah.
And for those of you who don't watch the show every day, every morning when we let the panelists in, we go through a process that has become dubbed the clickety click. And often it's Jeffrey, but whoever's managing the attendance that day has to literally click on every person who comes into the panel. So I can't imagine what that's like for a large webinar with hundreds of people. Having to go through that click process would be painful at best. All right, I think we probably chatted through this enough. Chris, let's go on to the next, or Guy, let's go on to the next one. Yeah.
Sure thing. Let's go with this one with Dan from Erie, Pennsylvania. And he says, playing with NDI HX camera app on iPhone and Mac Mini as a virtual camera in Zoom. I see the NDI audio, but don't see the NDI video as a camera choice in Zoom.
So those of you who are NDI users, Todd Reynolds is among them, and so is Stuart. So let's start with Todd. Go ahead.
You do need to launch the NDI app. I mean, this is probably, you've done this. I'm just saying that at least for me, when I don't find my NDI listed, I go up and I launch the virtual input app on the laptop, and that gives me instant input into Zoom.
Okay, Stuart's going to weigh in, and then Doug Ferguson, I know, does a lot of NDI connections. So go ahead, Stuart.
Was our questioner asking about running the virtual input on the... Hang on, I've just brought up the question back up so I can read through it again. Is he talking about seeing the NDI video on Zoom on the phone or on...
He says he sees the NDI audio, but can't see the NDI video as a camera choice inside Zoom. So he's not getting control.
It should pop up exactly like a normal webcam because that's what I use every day.
Doug, do you want to add something? And have you seen this phenomenon of video without audio or audio without video?
This has tripped me up before, and I know it works this way on a PC, but when it is in the icon in the right corner, there is a setting in the virtual input that you actually had to turn it on. Sometimes by whatever the software does, it has silence as the option. So you actually have to turn it on as system audio, and then the audio comes back. I mean, that's happened to me before.
Okay, so it's not unheard of. Jeffrey, do you have any more thoughts?
One more thing is, if you ever have any problems with NDI, go into Studio Monitor and check it there first. If it's coming through Studio Monitor, then you know a good direction to go from there, whether it's inside the machine or whether you need to check your network.
Great. Beju, let's finish things up.
One thing that sometimes if you haven't restarted the system, you definitely should do that before that. And if you're on an M1, I think there are some bugs with the NDI implementation on M1 right now. So you need to do a little bit of work to get it working.
That's actually not, I've run into that before when new machines or new operating systems come out, little bugs will show up like that. And sometimes that's what you're facing. The next operating system update will cure things. That's always a good feeling when it stops being a problem. All right, let's go on to the next one, Guy.
All right, we got one in from Rupert McRae in Dallas, Texas, and he says, sometimes a contributor has to be brought in over an alternative system like Skype or WebEx for whatever reason. What is the most less likely system you have ever had to patch into just to get an outlier into an event in a pinch?
Ooh, that must be challenging. I know Alex's process of having individual laptops that are connected to a actual switcher in order to populate some of his things would probably make that really easy. But how many of you have had experience with being on a Zoom call and needing to bring in a WebEx participant? Is that even possible? And how do you accomplish it? John Preto's nodding that it is possible. Have you done that? Or Guy, do you want to weigh in on?
Yeah, I'd say a crazy one would be something like FaceTime, but one that we had to do, which was just crazy at the last minute. Somebody had one of these live view backpacks, and we got this crazy idea during a 24-hour live stream that had like 11,000 people on it to go down to the local mall and dance through the mall, like film it as we're going through the mall with a GH5 on a little
they danced
rig.
with a backpack
with the live
stream,
the camera
which is not light.
Yeah. So how did we get the video in? Well, we couldn't just patch it right in, so we did a screen scrape. So we were able to get it in a web browser. We made the web browser full screen, and then a TriCaster sucked it in from there. That was about the craziest one, where it was like last minute, the talent wanted to do this, and we were like, how can we make this work? So we made it work. It was a crazy one.
That's the magic of production. You find yourself facing a problem you never pre-imagined and having to solve it. I think that skill set is one of the things that makes projects like these magical. You feel great when you have actually solved it. Talak, you want to weigh in on this?
Yes. So for me, the thing that has always been really good and ubiquitous and everybody can kind of get to it because it's totally free is OBS.Ninja. And that allows you to pull in a very high quality feed and then use it in a particular kind of situation that you would need. For me, it was flipped on its head a little bit because we needed to bring in a contributor, but we didn't have a bumped Zoom meeting. So we were at 360, but we couldn't work with 360. So we used OBS Ninja to get in a 1080p feed for, you know, work that we were doing in a media server on site. But you can flip that on its head and bring in a contributor to a Zoom call in that way. And it's super, it's pretty robust. Let me.
As soon as you mentioned OBS Ninja, I saw an amazing number of heads nod in the panel. Ant, do you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, I co-sign OBS Ninja because it has additional audio controls that you can put in for each participant and manage it as a director, just like you would with any other piece of software.
Great. Hopefully Rupert in Dallas has now some avenues to explore to solve his problems. And let's move on to the next question.
Alrighty, Daniel Goldstein in Washington, D.C. asks, what's the latest update on last week's Office Hours YouTube feed of a screen scrape computer as a participant and the variable delay it had? I've watched them after the fact, and it seemed to be an issue throughout the week.
Yeah, there seemed to be some instability. I wasn't around for that, so I think other people here are going to have to weigh in on what you what was your analysis of what might have been taking place. I know Alex hasn't come back and said, you know, we've done the postmortem and figured out exactly what it was. But Aaron, what are your thoughts?
So I know I was on the comms the whole time. I know that Andy was constantly writing the delay between Zoom and, well, the input to the mixer and the rest of the chain. The problem is that there's so many things in the chain that it's really hard to determine on the fly what, you know, it's hard to troubleshoot that when you're already in the show. So I know that Alex and others, Kevin and probably Andy as well, are trying to take variables out of the system to try to figure out where the delay is coming from. And if it is Zoom, then obviously we open a ticket with Zoom and we figure it out. But it's definitely one of those weird things to track down, especially in a live situation where you don't know where it's coming from. And it's sort of impossible to tell because you have very limited ways of managing things. We didn't have any delay on the output at all other than the audio mixer itself. There was no delay on any of the video side of it. So
you were feeding a clean signal. It's just when it hit Zoom, you had those
who knows
latencies.
Who really knows? It's like, you know, you got to tear it apart and you put it back together one piece by piece to figure out where it's coming from. So.
Yeah, well, that's the process of troubleshooting. So yeah, I think everybody here is familiar with that. Yeah, so let's move on. I will make this last note. I'm sure Alex is really interested in this and figuring it out. So if you keep watching Office Hours and are interested in exactly what happened to that, I'm sure he'll suss it out eventually and report back. So good reason to keep tuning in. Move on. Let's go to the next question, Guy.
All righty. We've got one from Rupert McRae in Dallas, and he says, according to the Wall Street Journal, executives at some of the world's largest technology firms are leaving prime jobs to join startups that build communications and collaboration tools. Are these good career moves?
And this brings up a conversation perhaps about the nature of work today. Charles Klein, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a good move. I know some people, for example, one of my friends was the lead tech at one of the big banks and was plucked by a startup, and between the bonus just to move over to the new company, his salary, plus the bonus at the end of the year, plus the stock options and everything else, it's actually worked out great for him. And what they usually do is over the course of a few years, they will go to another company where they will receive options and stock options that they can invest. And after 20 years that you've jumped around to 3 or 4 companies, then you have a very nice portfolio, you could say, to retire on from options and stocks that you have collected over the years. So it usually turns out to be a very, very smart thing to do.
I've read 2 or 3 articles over the course of the last few years about the millennials and generations coming up, not expecting what our parents and probably to a lesser extent, but still a lot our generation did, which was you'd go to work for a company, you'd spend most of your career there, maybe had something after that, but now a lot more agility in expecting to work for various employers. And that's an interesting phenomenon. Aaron, how do you feel about it?
So I've done the startup world quite a bit in my career. My sense is that a lot of these new solutions, new companies doing these things are, most of them are building to be bought by a larger company. And so that's their cash out, right? That's their exit. And so they're riding a wave, right? And at some point there's a consolidation wave that happens on top of this other wave, right? And then you end up with, you know, hey, somebody that makes a lot of money, there's still a lot of risk, right? Because your company might not be the one that makes that hits at the right point. It's a game in a lot of instances for people. And you know, I don't know how I think about it, but that's what happens. And you know, the fact is that at some point there will be a consolidation of all these different tech companies, all these startups into, you know, the larger beings, and then there'll be another wave of them doing another thing, and you know, that's the way it works, right? So,
the cycle continues. And
yeah,
I think it's a generational thing, considering nowadays, even when it comes to homes and housing, a lot of people don't want to buy houses. They'd rather rent because they want the opportunity to get up and go wherever they want to go, whenever they want to go. And some people, they're comfortable with that level of risk when it comes to their employment, when it comes to their housing. So you have to look at your own personal scenario. I worked for a company for 16 years, and I ended up feeling like a bit of a punk in the end, because I should have just been a mercenary when I look back at it. But your mileage may vary.
Yeah, I think that I've felt like reading things. I've been self-employed for so long that I never had much of that corporate experience, but I've worked in corporate video. I've seen the inside of those, and I've worked with everyone from executives to mid-level to the line employees. And I just think that this is another shifting era. You know, everybody is so mobile and so connected digitally that the reasons we used to stay in one geographic area for work are getting fuzzier out there. We got a lot of people who want to weigh in on this. So let's start with Jesse, then Jeffrey, and then Courtney, and then Paul. Go ahead, Jesse.
Yeah, so those were really interesting perspectives from all three people that were just speaking about it. My own experience with this was I did join, this is internet, you could call it 1.0, around 2000. I left a company to join an internet startup, and I was offered an okay salary, but a lot of stock options. And I was really made to believe that when they went public, I'd be extremely wealthy. Well, it didn't turn out. So you do have to be careful. And unfortunately, there's also somewhat of this, you could call it an abusive culture in startups, where they expect you to work crazy hours and not pay you that well on the hope that you're going to be the unicorn company that makes it. And yeah, most of them don't.
Jeffrey, you're up.
Yeah, the biggest thing with startups, and this all depends on which startup it is. I mean, if you've got a financial startup, if you've got anything in government or anything like that, that can kind of lock you down even more. Yeah, if I've worked with a lot of startups that have gone for the glory, and they sat there and they just worked on code until they pretty much didn't exist anymore. So it is a tricky subject, and trying to get back into the regular workaday job, it gets a little bit tougher.
How many people watched the Social Network movie and said, that's what I'm going to do? Courtney, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with most of whatever's been said so far. It's if you look at it as a gamble, and that it is, it's less like a crapshoot and more like a roulette, especially when you're dealing with communications and collaboration tools. Because in order to succeed in that field, you have to have everybody on the same software. And so you not only have to establish a product that works, you have to dominate the market to be successful. And then all the rest of them, once one beats its way to the top, then all the rest will fall aside, because everyone, like Zoom, is going to have to be using the same software in order to collaborate or communicate. So in that specific area, it's more of a crapshoot than just about any other type of software you're looking at.
Paul Wallace, you're going to finish things up for us before we move on.
Yeah, as much as I like to perpetuate the myth that San Francisco and New York are dying and Austin is exploding, the data, and you look at sites like Bloomberg and New York Times and Business Insider, they all are coming to the conclusion that the exodus from urban areas is a myth. It's just not. It's kind of halted in its tracks, and now these areas are going through kind of a resurgence with the lowering in prices of real estate, and quite a few articles bear this out that I just looked at.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've noticed a little of the same phenomenon. I think most of you know that I was in Arizona in the Phoenix and Scottsdale markets for most of my career, moved out to California to San Diego 3.5, 4 years ago. And I keep reading all these things about the downturn in, everybody's leaving California. And yet I look around and I've seen more opportunity. And the last set of statistics I saw yesterday said that we're actually again in a growth cycle. So it's really hard. My point in this is that these headlines come by that tells you this is a look at things for you in your career with your skill set that may or may not have anything to do with the reality you experience. Everybody's individual. I'm sure there are people who definitely have to leave a market like this that is expensive because whatever they do, however they've arranged their lives, it doesn't work for them, their families, or whatever. But there's probably going to be somebody else somewhere for whom that does fit. And there's this constant churn. I don't know if it's as easy as the headlines always make it seem to suss out what's really going on. Time will tell, I suppose. Let's move on to the next question.
All right. Daniel Goldstein in Washington, D.C. asks, any recommendations for live spoken word audio noise reduction at a lower cost than a sound device's noise assist, which probably means software on a computer I already own. Obviously, latency is bad, and fluctuating latency is even worse.
So the specific ones, the sound devices noise assist, it works in the same general space as a program called Cedar, which has been around for a long time. I've run across that in the voiceover industry because I've had to record VO and I've had to record people like executives talking in circumstances where the noise profile of the room I'm working in has been very bad. And the Cedar system, which was a high-end system used for professional recorders, has saved our rear ends time and time again in getting a clean voice recording out of noisy. That stuff is now migrating down, and I just was fascinated to find that the UAD, Universal Audio line of little small desktop interfaces have that available as a plugin now for $350, I think. That's in the same realm as noise assist that everybody talks about here. So I do know there's a lot of activity about that kind of noise reduction, and it's getting less expensive because that's moved from being $1,000 plus product to being a few $100. Tucker, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, there's plenty of ways to do it. I use Waves noise suppressor, which is a pretty inexpensive way to go. And you can use it with a VST host. Yep.
So I guess keep looking around, look specifically for articles that talk about the kind of noise suppression you're doing, because I think something that works live as opposed to a post-processing suite where there are plenty of third-party plugins that will do hiss reduction and noise suppression on a recorded track, but these new ones are doing it live in real time. It's a pretty exciting time to have those tools available. I don't see any other hand. Oh, no, wait, Courtney's up there. So go ahead, Courtney. Sorry.
Pick me. No, I was just going to say, if you have an NVIDIA graphics card, an RTX graphics card, there's RTX Voice, which does a very good job of, artificial intelligence noise removal of a variety of different sounds. And I believe it's free. So just Google NVIDIA RTX Voice and you'll see some samples that look pretty amazing.
There you go. Can't beat the price point. Let's move on to the next question.
All right, we got one coming in from Hazma Gajar in Cape Town, and he says, hello, John Barker. Can you give us a quick demo of H2R gear? I am trying to design my audio-video chain for a medical event in 10 days' time.
All right. Hazma, do you want to add anything before John jumps in?
Well, I think he's jumped out.
Is he jumped out? Oh, gosh.
Yeah. I asked a question, and I think he heard me, and so he bailed out. So he's now an attendee.
Maybe we can move that over into locked, and if we see him back on, revisit it. If I'm just guessing that might be a process, and we'll move on to the next question whenever.
All right, next one's coming in from Douglas Carmichael, and he says, have any production software hardware companies thought of making their products accessible to those with disabilities? In my experience, many smaller vendors have not even thought of accessibility at all.
It's definitely a thing out there, and you know, I'm on both sides of that. I spend a lot of time doing volunteer work for a group in Arizona called Sun Sounds that worked with people who are print impaired and people with visual disabilities. And there was a lot of action and energy in that space, but of course, not as much as many people would like. I think there's solutions out there that are better and better if you can find them, but let's go. Carl has his hand up, so let's see what you want to contribute.
A lot of manufacturers are adding software control to their hardware, let's say a lighting console or an audio console, and that allows people with disabilities who have software that allows them to use accessibility features. So they may have a layer of software on their computer that allows them to control many software via the way they choose, and that'll allow them to actually control these lighting and audio consoles using the software available from the manufacturers.
I will say that the Americans with Disabilities Act, for those of you who work in the U.S., really did change a good little bit of the landscape. I know people yell about government regulation and things like that, and probably fairly in a lot of cases, but that specifically in the communities that I was working around made paying attention to serving disabled audiences a much more present thing in many companies' minds than it was before the passage of that act. So in that particular case, we saw a lot of regulation lead to a lot of action and a lot more accessibility required for companies doing business, at least on the scale the government gets involved in. Let's do Jeffrey Powers, then John Preto, and then
Yeah,
Justin.
when I was working for state government, if you had to make a web page, you had to make it accessible for everybody, and that included everything. But I remember back in the day when Dragon Nuance, before it was bought by Nuance, Dragon Software had a lot of the patents for a lot of the speech to text stuff, and it was basically licensed. They had to license it. They came out with a free version that people could use, but it still had to go through their systems to do. And I think that's changed since then. But it was kind of tied down at the beginning, and hopefully a lot of these companies will start to see what people are asking for and make it, because even with people without the disabilities can use these things to our advantage as well.
It's interesting. So you saw a kind of a breakdown between intellectual property rights and disability access, at least in that circumstance. John Preto, and then we'll come back to Stuart.
Yeah, a couple of our clients specifically asked for this because it's mandatory, and we do captions. We use Google and then feed those back into Zoom, and then we have a live ASL signer person as well that we're able to use live. But he didn't say whether or not it was on site or live. All of our stuff is done virtual, but we do offer those two services.
Stuart, then Jesse Schwartz will finish this up.
I just bumped a button by mistake, so let's go.
Okay, then Jesse, I think, had an actual comment on this. Go ahead, Jesse.
Sure. It's just a thought that with spatial audio, it could be really useful for someone that's visually impaired. If you imagine the Zoom grid and they're not seeing it, but they heard the voices placed throughout the room, it could really help key you in to that person, because each time they talked, it would be in the same three-dimensional space. At any rate, but there was talk about the American with Disabilities Act. For me, in the architecture world, that passed in 1991, and it probably impacted building design more than anything in the last century for the better. A lot of things were implemented. And in California, interestingly, every time I need to renew my architectural license, the only thing I'm tested on is California handicap accessibility laws. So very important in California.
Excellent. All right. Well, we're moving on to the next topic. Go ahead.
Another one in from Douglas Carmichael, and he says, when you are setting up a large lighting/video system, how do you make sure each element is addressed properly and communicating with the console/media server?
Okay. Boy, that's a big topic. Stuart, you want to dive into it first?
Yep. One light at a time. There's no other way to do it. It's just going to take you a while, and you go through and you make sure your settings are all correct, one light at a time.
Why do I want to go back in the day? We had rotary faders, and they didn't talk to anything. And now everything is DMX or something that lets you control everything remotely. Beju, weigh in.
Yeah, same as Stuart. You basically have to go light at a time. What we normally do is we basically make a grid, all the names, unique names if possible, if the fixture supports that, to have a specific unique name to make it easier to find, and specifically making a note of the universe and the DMX channels, and just lots and lots of lists and labels. You can put on the lights as well to keep track of them if needed.
All right, let's go to John Fredo, and then we're going to slip down to Talak, who does a lot of work in this. Go ahead, John.
So I worked on DMX all weekend, and I just can't believe that these fixtures don't have Ethernet. I'm told it's because of the old days, that because of the heat inside of the fixture was too hot. But if they have DMX controls in there, why won't Ethernet work? You'd think they could shield that out. It's a pain. I'm using LightKey software, which is great for addressing all of your fixtures. They have a great little mapping program to put all your fixtures in. And then it's on Ethernet. I use the NTAC controller on Ethernet to talk DMX to all the fixtures. That way I can use a multitude of machines or iPads or whatever to control the NTAC. And then the big guys, I talked to 2 lighting directors over the weekend. They've got stuff in the stratosphere. Their light boards and their software that they have is incredible here on the Strip, Las Vegas.
Yeah, I have a little trouble figuring out that heat is that big a problem in this era, now that we've gone to mostly chips and things like that, as opposed to carbon arc follow spots. Talak, bring us home.
Okay, so yes, you need to address each light one light at a time, but I got to push back on one light at a time. You got to look at the whole system, and you've got to have a way to track each light, because you have hundreds, maybe thousands of lights, definitely thousands of addresses, possibly hundreds of universes. So we use programs like LightWrite and Vectorworks, and those work in conjunction with each other. So you can put information on the paperwork that comes out to the person that's putting it up. And LightWrite will actually make stickers, which will give information about each unit, and then you put those stickers on the unit, and then the person that's hanging it will know exactly which address to use, and so that because you have multiple people, it's not just one person doing it, and so the information has to flow always. Otherwise, you start spending money and not getting anything done.
And Tucker wants to weigh in before we finish this up.
Yeah, a lot of fixtures have multiple profile ability. So having a very, very defined test process where you typically it's going to be like a red or something, but pick a channel, go with a single channel and a single value so that okay, all the profiles match. Because a lot of places the profile will shift those colors. So you may have like every light's red, but one light's blue. Okay, the profile's wrong on that. So there's a couple things like that. And then once you've done a quick validation there, typically going back and running some kind of an effect that has a smooth motion between that will help you identify outliers. So
I think our original questioner, Douglas Carmichael, is getting a lot of good information. So let's go back to Talak for more details.
I'm sorry to jump back in here. I just want to say that Tucker's point about modes is very, very important. It's not something that many people talk about or think about. But if you end up with 10 of the exact same lights on a pipe, and all of them have different modes, they will never work the same, and you'll be really confused. And so again, on those stickers, it should say what mode you're wanting to use, because that's actually a design idea. You might want to use a certain kind of mode for color picking versus another kind of mode for color picking if you're doing studio television kind of work versus theater work. And so please keep that one in mind.
Excellent. Well, I think we've covered this in a way that was very helpful, and that's our job here. So great job, all panelists. Guy, let's move on to the next question.
All right, Richard Lavery here on the panel asks, and he's in Belfast, UK, and he says, on a recent project, after coloring in Resolve, we checked the render in QuickTime, and it had a flat look compared to Resolve. Playing in VLC, it looked exactly like Resolve. Is this down to how QuickTime deals with color?
Ooh, I'm always tempted when I see the words flat look to think somebody got stuck in RAW, but let's see what everybody else thinks. Carl Asmussen, let's do you first, then Stuart, then Charles.
Let's go to Charles first.
But he's going to knock out everybody else's. All right, let's go to
It
Charles
could be
first.
anything. Oh, no, because so then, all right. It sounds like a gamma issue, which a lot of Mac OS has to deal with, and they've tried to resolve it with like the 709A tag and the sRGB tags and everything. So what you're dealing with is just a gamma shift. Now, that's an ongoing thing, and depending on what platform you play it, the browser, VLC, QuickTime, they all tend to do their own little thing. So we try to tag everything for web as 111, which is like it's 709 sRGB essentially, which is like the lowest standard, but it's the standard that everybody reads properly. But there could be many things that you're dealing with. You could be rendering in full instead of video, depending on what you're doing. So if you want to reach out to me, we can continue the conversation we've been having.
So I'm hearing that the control codes that go out through the software are the same, but each instrument from different manufacturers may interpret that differently because they're using a different part of the standard. Is that fair to say, Charles?
It's mostly in the tagging, and it's something that you really have to pay attention to because it's just a way, especially on Macs, they manage color in a very particular way, and it only works on Macs. As soon as you go outside of something that is Mac base, it tends to shift a little bit. That's why Resolve has to use Mac OS color profiles in Viewer to make sure that what you see in the Viewer in Resolve is matching what you see in the render. But then that causes some other issues, especially if you have a professional monitor and you're rendering at 709 2.4 gamma. Your pipeline to get that to look correct on your regular monitors and on the web it's a little tricky. So you have to pay attention to that whole thing. So we can get into it, Richard.
Okay, it's a fascinating subject to me because I remember I came out of the era where every television had to be calibrated individually, and I used to walk into a sports bar and I'd see 17 TVs and 16 of them looked different from every other one. It was the Wild West in terms of how the profiles look. And I do remember when Apple started doing their managed color pipeline, at least there was some consistency across things like iPads and Mac screens, some consistency. It may not have been perfect, but it was, you could kind of depend on it. But now we've got equal devices from Samsung and God knows who all. I mean, so many people are manufacturing these screens and we're watching them as if it is a reference, and it certainly in many cases is not. So we're trying to fix that. Stuart, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, firstly, we've assumed that Richard is using a Mac because he could be using a PC, he could be using Linux. But one thing to think about as well is not all video drivers are the same on the GPU cards. Some of the software allows for custom profiles for whether it's a video is playing in VLC or if it's playing in QuickTime or if it's playing in Movie Player Classic, and will adjust the color according to what profiles are set there by the user. Maybe there's a flat profile being set up for QuickTime. It could be something as simple as that, but I would refer back to the answers we've had in the last 5 minutes because there's a lot of detail to go through on those.
Also, I'm interested, he says VLC, the video LAN controller, ubiquitous software that's out there, and people on both Mac and PC use it all over the place. It is everywhere. And I'd be interested, Charles, do you have information on how, is there a profile that VLC adds to things, or is it interpreting every type of color equally, or am I just confused?
It's just inherent, and there's, how could I put it? It's a little fractured.
Okay.
And what we've come to is that we tend to tag, if it's going for web, the lowest possible, which is probably like a 709 or sRGB, because we then look at everything on different browsers, on different types of players, and we tagged everything properly, and we could see the little shifts and we measure them, right? So you're going to have a little bit of a shift here and there. Now, when you have something that looks that drastically different, that's just a gamma shift. That's probably something tagged wrong just on output. It could be that it's reading the profile from the timeline. You know, it could be something like that. So we could definitely it could be a lot of things, Richard. So we could get into it.
Yeah, it's a complex world that Charles lives in as a professional colorist. And I think all of us who are trying to learn this, it'd be nice if there was a simple, just use this and press this and it'll be fine, but we're not there and probably never be. All right, we've got 10 questions and about 20 minutes, a little 22 minutes, 23 minutes to get through them. So we're gonna move up the pace a little bit. Guy, let's move on.
All right, Douglas Carmichael says, what brand / model of Windows laptop would you recommend with an RTX 30XO graphics card, preferably a 3080, maybe a 3070 GPU, and durable build similar to a MacBook Pro? I've heard negative stories about Razer's support and service despite their build quality being the most Apple-like.
Who has, okay, Jeffrey Powers, dive in.
So Razer, I'm not exactly sure where that came from with the support. Razer's been pretty decent, but the two brands that I am really gearing towards nowadays is Asus. Asus has been doing a lot of stuff in their ROG series, ROG Strix. I don't have a specific model number for you, but then MSI also is a great laptop that you can get with Core i7 or Ryzen, for that matter, and get some good graphics on there. But you might want to wait a couple months because the T series just got announced, and it's going to probably grow within the next couple months. So if you can wait, I would go for the 3080 T series, TI series.
Stuart, you want to pop in?
Yeah, don't forget that the silicon issue with the shortages worldwide is affecting all the availability of GPUs. An alternative to Jeffrey's solution or suggestions would be a Lenovo with a Quadro or the equivalent level GPU instead of the GTX GPUs now.
Great. Hopefully that gives you some thoughts and some avenues to pursue. Let's go to the next question.
All right, Philip Bowler asks, plugging my Pile headset mic into a Boya 35C-XLR Pro adapter into a Behringer analog mixer doesn't work. The Pile is tip sleeve and I assume the Boya is TRS, but using a TRS extender still doesn't work. Any ideas?
We've had this discussion a good little bit as we've talked about, particularly in the early days of the pandemic, the kits that were being sent out and how some, particularly 3.5 millimeter plugs, just didn't seem to be compatible from those microphones into things. And did we ever settle on a solution that works all the time? Courtney, do you remember?
Solution I found that works all the time is to cut off the TS plug and put it on a TRS plug and don't connect the ring to anything. So,
okay, so if you were handy with a soldering iron, you may have a hope. And Tucker Dragoo gives you just a big thumbs up on that solution. So, and besides, learning to solder is healthy for all people who are involved in anything technological. You know, at some point that may be your only solution. Let's do Jeffrey and Talak really quickly before we move on. Go ahead, Jeffrey.
I don't remember us talking about the Boya. I think we were talking more about the Rode and using that adapter, and that's pretty inexpensive. So give that a try and see what happens.
Yeah, we've talked about this a good little bit on Office Hours. So I think since we have an index to this, if you're in the Office Hours Discord, you could probably do some searching and come up with some useful information with the past. Talak, let's go with you.
Just 15 seconds. I just want to say the point is you got to make sure that there isn't anything that is touching both sides. Two different outputs that are hitting one piece of metal, which is then of course going to short it out. And so that's the key. And you need to look at the pinout. And so more than just cutting off connectors and putting them in, figure out what the actual signal path is.
Yeah, I would say learn to solder and then learn to examine your solder joints and make sure that they have been done correctly and that you don't have a lot of slop in there. Let's move on. Next question.
All right, next one's in from Philip Polar, and he says, 2 weeks ago at the Memorial Golf Tournament in Ohio, the cicadas were in full force. The sound was horrendous on the CBS broadcast. Couldn't they have done some kind of noise canceling on this live sound?
Bugs in the background. Let's do Carl and then Aaron Husledge.
All right, so cicadas are a particular problem because they communicate to each other on different frequencies, so different pitches. So their pitch of their call is different for each group. So therefore, they're actually got a very broad spectrum of calls. So no matter which frequency you try to pull down, there's another cicada on another frequency talking. It's like 10,000 microphones, wireless microphones on 10,000 different frequencies, all going at once. So
it's like
sorry to
radio
interject, Carl. You
communications at
just
the
proved
Olympics.
that you have knowledge in every corner of the world.
Let's move on. Was it Aaron and then Stuart real quick?
Noise reduction is not magic. And no, you can't. There's nothing you could do about that. Is basically what Carl said too.
Stuart?
A lot of the features of the way cicadas make noise is also how everybody who doesn't have tinnitus can understand what it is like to have tinnitus, because that's what it sounds like all the time.
I've told this story before, but I got one of my largest clients because it was PetSmart, and they had done a video recording inside one of the shops, and the crickets that they keep around for the people who have reptiles, that's their diet. The crickets were really noisy that night, and that's the only reason I got my foot in the door, and I ended up with 15 years of work for that. So I'm appreciative of the difficulties of dealing with background noise. It's sometimes an opportunity, but it's hard. Todd, do you want to do a real quick thing before we move on? We've got 8 questions.
I also, of course, respect Carl's knowledge to the skies, but I'm surprised that he didn't mention the Waves multi-frequency cicada remover. The plugin works great.
Yeah, the only problem is that all your humans sound like robots after you use it. This would be great if insects were an entirely different part of the frequency band. But that doesn't seem to be how it works out. Let's move on.
One of those apps you just have to buy once every 17 years.
That's right. Guy,
actually, if the this is noise assist at 0, and if my crickets from my daughter's lizard, you can maybe hear him listen. And now I'm going to turn up noise assist. And now I'll start talking in my normal voice and ask the next question. So the next one says, is there somewhere in the Mukana interface to see a list of all the / commands? I just learned about display mode, and it is great.
Chad's listening, but he's not here. He knows a lot about that. Anybody else know where the repository is? Jeffrey?
You can start with /?, and then it'll give you the first level of stuff, and then you can kind of go from there.
Okay, so that's how to dive in. There's a lot of depth in Mukana that is hidden, and I sometimes think, as much as I've spent time on it, I don't know anywhere near all of what it's capable of doing yet. Let's move on.
All right, Mark Hadley in Seattle asks, how is OBS Studio 27 on Linux?
Any OBS Studio drivers? John Preto.
I'm running it on a Ubuntu install, and it installed and it's running fine, but it gets very, very little use. So stay tuned. I'll do some more testing on it.
Okay. And good of you to say that. I sometimes think half the reviewers on YouTube got the package on Tuesday and wanted to get their review out on Wednesday. So all they've done is open it up and make sure it works, and haven't done any deeper testing than that. So thank you for I'm actually going to use the product and test it under stress and load and see if it holds up. That's usually a better way to do things. Let's move on. Next question.
All right, Talaloka Miguel Lopez Waterman in New York asks, what tricks do you use to separate the cross pickup of different instruments in the orchestra per individual mic?
I think that's a second hour question.
Yeah, I had
so let's
tag that as second hour.
Yeah, it's got orchestra. For those of you who don't know, there is a system after you post or while you're posting a question in Mukana. Make sure you look at the tags there and set the tags. That helps us separate and get the first hour stuff dealt with in the first hour. And then we're going to hold that for the second hour orchestral discussion.
Bill, do you know how to move that one over so that it goes back to
Yeah, I do. I believe that I do.
Did it get unpacked?
There we go. All right. So the next one is Alex. Here we go. Alex Telestanine in Seattle at DebDubDC. Apple has announced new Sessions API for third parties to integrate FaceTime into custom applications. Do you know if Zoom has similar type of API available for iPads and Apple TV devices?
Does anybody know the ecosystem? They announced a lot of stuff and had a ton of sessions. I think there were almost 200 sessions at WWDC this year on all sorts of Apple technology. Aaron, go ahead.
There is a Zoom SDK. It does not support, because, well, in theory, it could support multiple use cases like that. It doesn't because Apple won't let it. And I don't believe Google lets it do it either. So third-party apps are limited, are in sandboxes. So you can't really do what you're talking about outside of the operating system.
Yeah, it was interesting. All right, moving on. We've still got 7 questions plus whatever in the queue right now. So let's keep the pace up. Let's go.
All right, here we go. Douglas Carmichael in a NASA press release. They analogized the power in a fuel pump to lighting for Major League Baseball stadiums for large lighting systems. How is power and control data / videos distributed to each part of the system? Do you have multiple feeds?
So that's an interesting way to write that. In a NASA press release, they analogize the power in a fuel pump. Oh, that must be for like the space shuttle. It's not a car fuel pump, but a major. So it requires that kind of power as if you were dealing with a baseball stadium's lighting system. Interesting. Jeff Francis, you want to chat about that? And we'll go to Carl.
Touring concert systems typically have their own power distro that they travel with, and they'll tie into 3-phase power, some kind of main disconnect backstage that has 3-phase power, so 5 wires. It's got the 3 phases plus ground and neutral, and it gives you out standard power on multiple circuits, and typically will separate lighting onto one circuit and audio onto another circuit.
Carl, go ahead, and then Talak.
Yeah, to extend on what Jeff was saying, so there's shipping container size generators that you'll see show up at large concerts, and they'll usually have several of them. So they'll have a backup version, an auxiliary version, the primary version, and these shipping containers will just usually run on diesel, and they'll actually power the concert. So the local utility is not powering the concert necessarily.
Talak?
That's all great information. Also, you want to make sure that the loads are balanced, because then if the loads get unbalanced, then the generator will start to run in a way that it can't keep up, and it's also fairly dangerous. So keep loads balanced, make sure that you're giving yourselves enough safety margin.
Stuart, real quick.
I'm just going to reiterate what our own Mickey has written in the chat. Tons of copper, literally tons, well planned and laid out. And I could talk about the lighting that comes from a turbo pump on the bottom of a rocket engine, but I won't.
Okay. I can't resist doing this. In the 70s, I got great tickets to a Pink Floyd concert. They had to delay it weeks because there was not enough power in the basketball stadium to run the show. So they had to take the time to run copper cables between the football stadium next door and the music center in order to give them enough juice to run Dark Side of the Moon. So it was an interesting concert experience, to say the least. Let's move on.
All right, another one in from Douglas, and he says, would there be any online courses focused on AV control systems like AMX and Crestron, or do those vendors only offer training at their facilities?
Anybody know if they have online access? You'd think everybody now with a robust business, and those businesses have been around for a long time, would be online. Tucker, what do you think?
Yeah, I believe that Crestron and AMX both have started, based on last year, have started doing online versions of their in-class training. They're typically not your join a webinar kind of thing. They're pretty specific and registrations required and all that sort of thing. So yeah, I believe they have all at least temporarily moved to online.
Yeah, I would be shocked if companies at that level hadn't gotten an initiative going to move their stuff onto webinars or something that people can access. Just makes sense. Let's move on. Next question.
One in from Craig Kadoki in Toronto. He says, I'm having an issue with a new Intel Mac Mini seeming to not sync with the ViewSonic VG2860 MHL 4K over, I believe it means HDMI, but it says CDMI. I've tried 2 different HDMI cables and 2 different versions of the ViewSonic monitors. When I tried a 27-inch Dell 4K, it works perfectly.
So who knows monitors well enough to give him some suggestions on what might be the disconnect between the monitor as it's being driven by a PC and or I don't know what, no, Mac Mini. So he's doing Mac Mini out and he's trying to drive a 4K over HDMI and he's having trouble. It seems like that there's a lot of 4K monitors being driven by Mac Minis out there. So I'm a little surprised, but I don't know enough. Tucker has his hand up.
It might just be like a EDID issue between that display and that machine. That should be, if you're having that problem on, especially in that situation with 2 different displays, that's probably going to be documented somewhere. So you might reach out, just do some searching and see what you can learn about it. The other, other than talking to us, obviously, the other thing that you might try is if it's currently connected directly to HDMI, you might use a DisplayPort to HDMI adapter and kind of move it to a different output and see if you get any luck there.
It's also possible it's just a driver issue. So I'd go on the ViewSonic website and make sure there hasn't been some update. I don't know if you're on a Mac Mini and you bought it recently, it may have one of the newest operating systems and there may be some disconnect there. So those are some areas to look at. Next question.
Another one in from Douglas, and he says, John, I really like the portable case that you have your X32 core and interface box in. Is that an SKB case? And he has in parentheses, I've heard horror stories about SKB cases breaking easily.
John, dive in and let's go pretty quickly because we still got 6 questions here.
No, this is a Gator case. I heard same stories about the SKB. So this is Gator. Really, really happy, and their customer support was outstanding.
Nice. Next question.
Hasmic says, okay, John Barker is not in the panel. Other panelists can answer my earlier question. Simple macro in ATEM is saved. John's layout macro copied in clipboard. Open saved XML file of simple macro. How to paste the clipboard copied macro.
So he's looking for how to paste a macro into the ATEM or from the ATEM into something else. Anybody have, Aaron?
Yeah, you have to open the XML file that's saved out of the ATEM control, find the macros section. If there isn't one, you need to create a macro in the thing, because sometimes it'll save out without them. You could create a macro in the switcher first and then save it out so that there's a space for it. And then you could just replace that section. Just paste over it. Make sure the tag's balanced though, or it won't work.
Sounds like it's a little bit of trickiness to
you can mess it up.
Macros.
Yeah.
Sounds like there's a text form that the macro has to be in for it to recognize it. Would that be an accurate statement?
Yeah, the XML is text. Yeah.
Okay. Hasmic, really quickly, do you want to add something there?
Yeah, no, it's just exactly what to delete from the old saved macro and where to paste the new one. That's really what I'm trying to understand. There's probably obviously instructions at the top and at the bottom to run the macro.
Talak has a hand up, so let's have him weigh in real quick. Yeah.
The thing to do is to make yourself a macro just without any extra software on the ATEM and know all the commands that you have in it, so you can look at the start tag and the end tag, and then you'll always know exactly what you need to look.
Okay, let's move on to one of the next non-orchestral questions. So we're getting close to the top of the hour here.
Paul Valhus in Austin, Texas says the NBC Olympics has chosen the Audio-Technica AT4050 ST and Audio-Technica in general for their mics of choice. Why don't we see more of these mics in office hours?
Promotional mic placement in large events. That's never happened before. Not that there's anything wrong with Audio-Technica mics. AT has been a venerated company for decades and has a lot of great microphones, but the fact that it was chosen may mean that there were some promotional consideration behind the scenes. Tucker, you want to weigh in on that?
At the very beginning of office hours, I came in on a Audio-Technica 4033. And they are fantastic mics. I mean, the 4050s, 4033s, there's a lot of really, really good options in Audio-Technica's realm. The main thing that you'll see is that very few of us are running microphones that are large diaphragm condensers, and that's because they tend to pick up a lot of background noise. And that's kind of where Audio-Technica lives for a lot of theirs. They do have really good dynamics as well, but their large diaphragm condensers and small diaphragm condensers are really kind of their bread and butter.
Okay, Alex, did you have something you pop back in? Oops, you're muted.
I'm just a panelist. I just thought I'd sit in as a panelist.
He wants to come for the
over,
orchestral.
so I'm just watching. No, I'm just,
all right,
just watching.
Awesome. All right, let's move on to the next.
Your way.
Next question.
Actually, Alex, you took over host, so you might want to give it back to Stuart.
I didn't do it on purpose, Stuart. Don't
auto host.
Nice. I'll go ahead.
It's like when your pet sees you in the airport and just comes running to you.
That's very embarrassing. I was trying to just sneak in. I guess that didn't go so well.
All right, let's go through the rest of these guys. So let's Guy, go
Another
ahead.
one in from Douglas Carmichael, and he says the U.S. Air Force is partnering with an executive jet company, Exosonic, to explore supersonic travel for top leaders and diplomats. Could Alex's methods improve input meeting management, make remote government more effective, and reduce travel?
That would be a fascinating test. Stuart?
In many cases, yes, but in high security cases where you need face-to-face communication that can't be over or can't be listened in on by anybody else, you need people in the same room.
Okay.
I mean, the problem is there's an infrastructure to even doing the meetings. They do the meetings all the time. Like these leaders have ways of doing these meetings all the time. Like they just, some of them, to Stuart's point, need more. Sorry, I didn't raise my hand. I'll raise my hand in the future.
That's okay. Don't worry about it. Let's get through the rest of these. We've got a couple more questions here in first hour. So, Guy?
Douglas Carmichael again. Has the office hours group thought of offering a resume writing / editing service, or at least a regular meeting to discuss resumes geared towards our industry?
Resumes are an interesting subject. I mean, it's hard. I don't know where they are now. They've changed a lot over the course of time, from when people were first doing them on paper and then they moved to doing them electronically and hiding a bunch of keywords. I know a lot of people who suggested if you want to get your resume brought up to the top, you hide a lot of keywords and white text on white background. Alex, you had thoughts on this?
Yeah, I don't read people's resumes. The only thing that matters is LinkedIn. There's not, like figuring out, like bringing a specialist and talk about how to prep your LinkedIn thing is important, but I wouldn't bother with a resume. LinkedIn is, in our industry, LinkedIn is the thing. Anyway.
Tucker, real quick, and Ant, real quick, and then we're going to zip on. We've got 3 more questions to get through.
Yeah, in my life, I think I've had to turn in a resume maybe 3 times, and every job I've enjoyed, everywhere I've worked that I've enjoyed, has not involved a resume. It's all been, they heard about a thing that I did, and then I'm doing that thing, and
yeah. I think reputation trumps resume 99.9 times out of 100. Ant, did you have a comment real quick?
Yeah, I was just going to echo what Mr. Tucker just said. It's more so about your body of work and the reels that you can present. Most people aren't even looking at resumes. They just look for that reel on LinkedIn.
Yeah. Next question.
Mike Beardmore in Reading, UK says, is there a way of suppressing the Zoom bot chat messages reminding us to use Mukana so only other show-related messages are flagged?
Let's see. Who would have expertise in that? Alex, you would have expertise in that.
That's not a shot bot. That's a chatinator. That's the chatinator. The Chad Lafarge actually puts those in. No, there are no other messages. The bot's not getting in the way. We don't use the chat for anything other than to tell you how to get to Mukana. So if you're looking at the chat for anything other than how to get to Mukana, then you're using it for something it's not built for. We don't use that here. Go ahead.
And
sorry.
If you're bothered by the pop-up, then you can turn on your chat and put it into a window and drop it down lower into the window and get it out of your peripheral.
Or a second window or something like that. Yeah.
Last question. We made it through the list. Go ahead.
Last one comes in from Douglas Carmichael. What would you recommend for a durable stand to fit multiple sequential desktop synth modules? And he has a link here. And allow for cable management. And I've heard K&M stands can be very durable and versatile.
Any desktop keyboard or other processing? Tucker, go ahead.
I'm not specific with that sort of device, but I can speak for K&M as a brand. A couple of really, really great things about K&M. One, it's just incredibly sturdy stuff. 2, they hold their designs for a very, very long time, and you can get parts for them. So they're very repairable. I've only used K&M for a very long time.
Carl, real quick.
So for anyone who has desktop synthesizers that don't conform to 19-inch rack mounts, Ultimate Support actually released a series here. So this is modular, so you can have 1 or you can have 2. They clamp in, so this is designed to hold your desktop modules that don't conform to 19-inch rack mount.
Nice. All right. So I think we've made it to the top of the hour, and it's time for Orchestral. This should be an exciting office hours. I'm really, I'm fascinated to listen to some of you. And I understand we have some people here on the panel who are going to be presenting. Who wants to lead off this transition of topic into orchestral music production in the modern era? Nobody's raising a hand. Well, that's going to be a really
well. Let's start with the. I'm going to jump in. Is it okay if I jump in?
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Take over.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So anyway, one of the things that I started thinking about a lot with this, and one of the reasons it's here is because I've been trying to figure out how to do this for, putting it in surround and so on and so forth. But then conversations started coming up, and it turned out that Carl and Jeff and Todd and other folks that here have Tulalak have all had some experience in that area, maybe more that I don't know of, and I thought, we got to pick their brain about how they approach this. So let's go ahead and let's throw it to Carl first. I mean, we've talked to it, and tell us, and then we're going to come to Jeff and coming to you, and then Todd. Just how do you approach this, or what are the key challenges of recording an orchestra? I think is how I would start it.
Depending on what they're performing. So if they're performing to an audience, they may be in a space that's not conducive to a good recording. So sometimes a live orchestra is not the best to record. So you may want to record them in a studio or in a controlled room. If they're performing for recording, or if you're lucky enough to get them in a rehearsal, like a dress rehearsal, where it's okay to record them, then that's kind of best of both worlds, where they're going to be performing, but there's no audience there's no coughing. You kind of get the best of both worlds. Speak to the conductor, so find out what type of music they like to perform and what they want to record, because I deal with community orchestras who they play for free. Most of their concerts are for free or for charity. So essentially I want to find out what's the best bang for buck for them. If I'm coming and helping them, what do they really want to record? What pieces do they want recorded, rather than me telling them what to record?
Jeff, what are the big challenges that you run into there?
So thinking about live with an audience versus recording session, there's kind of an unwritten rule or accepted by the audience that microphones that are on stage are for amplification, and microphones that are hanging are for recording. So the difficult thing is that oftentimes if there's an audience and this is an actual performance, we need to hang microphones, suspend them above the orchestra, which is just a logistical nightmare for moving microphones. To move a microphone 3 inches forward when it's on a stand, you walk down there, you push the stand forward. When you have to have it suspended from the catwalks and have pull wires, there's a lot of work to get that. And it's just this unfortunate stigma that amplification is something that shouldn't take place. It's kind of dying away a little bit, but the idea that an opera singer or a vocalist should be able to fill a 2,500 seat concert hall with their voice, that they should be enough. I'm going to want a mic there to record that voice in addition to what I have recording the orchestra, but generally I'll need to hang that mic and not put it on a stand in front of them. Getting into sort of pops music falls away from that. And then anything that I have deeper into the orchestra, say a pickup for the woodwinds, that's not an issue. But that's the first thing. In a recording session, there's just a lot more freedom because no one cares that there's a sea of microphone stands all amongst the orchestra.
If you have questions online for all of these folks, make sure to throw them in while we're kind of getting started, just turning up the engine a little bit. Todd, as someone who's actually been in the orchestra, what do you think are the challenges from a musician's perspective when it comes to those recording?
It's kind of interesting. I actually haven't. I kind of left the orchestral and classical world a long time ago. And have existed in the chamber music world and still in the classical world, where we took on miking of individual performers very easily. The group that I'm most closely affiliated with, called Bang on a Can, and my own former string quartet, Ethel, we put mics on ourselves. Kronos Quartet, the same way, all the time. In terms of going to the orchestral question, however, I think that, first of all, I'm here as you mentioned, as somebody who's experienced it rather than somebody who does it. So every single thing that Jeff just said, I'm all about, but I'm not the recording guy. Of course, Mac Kerr is also here. I've done some work with him in the past as well. Those folks who take on this question, Silas Brown, another good colleague of mine, those people who take on this question are kind of awesome for doing it in the face of orchestral musicians not wanting a lot of things around them and people around them. On Broadway, we've done it forever. On the stage with Bruce Springsteen and with other artists, we've done it forever. So it really is, when it comes down to the classical model itself, I think that where we've come to now is a is a place where I've mentioned the Zilia mic, for instance, who's done this kind of model in Unreal Engine. I'll put that in the Mukana as well again, where they've used a number of 19 channel microphones in an orchestra space, with the idea that this is somehow going to really spatialize and isolate in a way that we can really control the orchestra sound. So I'm kind of looking forward to hearing Jeff's and anybody else's, and Carl and everybody else's impressions on that type of a situation. I hope that's a good place to get started.
Absolutely. Tucker?
Yeah, one thing to consider in both amplification and recording for orchestra is that the room is as much the part of the instrument as the rest of it. And so a lot of times you'll wind up, if you close mic too much stuff and you don't have a lot out in the room, or good capture out in the room, you'll wind up with a pretty sterile kind of everything's in your face on one plane, and you don't really want that. You want that space. So if I'm miking for record or broadcast, I tend to separate the microphone from the instrument by a little bit. So I don't just have all that, like every single instrument is, your ear is next to it. You don't want that. So
go ahead. Tlaloc.
In my work, I go to a lot of different theaters with a lot of different acoustic signatures, and it completely is a completely different ball game every time. And so sometimes we're in a big, huge barn with square walls that doesn't fill well with the vocals, even though the whole tradition is, to not amplify the opera singers. So the conversation in the design of the show has to be brought up. So how, is this Sweeney Todd being done by an opera company? Let's mic them, because we want to hear that. We want to get that really informative pop sound into your ears. But if we're trying to mix it, we still may amplify that voice in order to make it sound like the room has good acoustics, which it oftentimes does not. And so the conversation comes up in many, many meetings. And weirdly enough, the lighting designer talks about it too.
Go ahead, Jeff. Oh, can't hear you, Jeff.
Sorry, missed with the mouse. Speaking about opera and vocal balance, it's interesting. If an opera or a musical is in English, the vocals need to be louder in relation to the orchestra that's there. If it's sung in Italian or German, and there are subtitles or supertitles, the melody comes through, but you don't need the diction to pick out the words, because most English audiences are getting that text through the supertitles, and they understand the meaning through what they're reading. And so actually the balance of the voices can be lower. They won't need amplification. You go to something like a musical or an opera that's in English, they may need direct amplification of the voices in order for the clarity of the text to come through. So it's every situation is different. Going back to just orchestra recording, what Tucker was saying about that distant thing, I start with a single stereo pair and move that stereo pair around to get the best balance of what the orchestra is creating. And then there are sometimes things that need additional help. A soloist, spots on the wood. As you get farther back in the orchestra, woodwinds, percussion, those may need some highlighting of spot mics, but really starts with that primary stereo pair. And it may be 80 to 95% of the sound.
And Charles?
Yeah, I dated an opera singer for about 8-9 years, and I remember each time that she would be in Europe, the way that they mixed her into the orchestra was more of another instrument. But in the States, it needed to sit on top of everything so that came through. And I always found that interesting. I didn't know why that is, maybe a cultural thing, but it only happened in the US, and I found that interesting. If anybody has any thoughts on that.
Salak?
I think a big major part of that is that culturally, the opera goers in Europe know opera really, really well. And so the storytelling is done by multiple viewings. And so there's a different need for certain storytelling situations. And also it's also style.
I do think it's interesting to your point that like if you're watching Nutcracker, most of us know what Nutcracker is. I mean, we're going to see the experience and experience it again, but we know what the story is, or Peter and the Wolf, or some of the ones that we've grown up with. you see often. I see, definitely get your point. Let's go ahead and jump. We've got questions starting to stack up. Let's jump to the first question.
All right, Talal Miguel Lopez Waterman asks, what tricks do you use to separate the cross pickup of different instruments in the orchestra per individual mic?
Good, Carl.
So yeah, spot miking is a good. So that's a good practice to have. You want to use cardioids as well, maybe supercardioids, depending on where you are. Like the harp is a very good example of that. So harps are usually a bit more delicate in their sound compared to like the brass, which is going to be on the other side of the stage usually. So that's a good that's a good example of spot miking is for like a harp.
Yep, Jeff.
So like I said, with that main stereo pair, that's going to pick up everything and a blend of everything. So that's not trying to differentiate. And then to add to that, what Carl's talking about, those spot mics. So again, hypercardioids are really great because they've got the most rejection for regular sort of first order cardioids, all the supercardioids, hypercardioids, cardioids, bidirectionals. Hypercardioid is the most directional. We tend not to use shotguns because the off-axis pickup of a shotgun mic is very colored sounding. So anything that does bleed in, and it will because you've got 80 musicians on a stage, the bleed from the other things will sound bad in a shotgun. And that will really color. So if I'm pointing a shotgun at the harp and the brass is bleeding in, the brass is going to sound terrible and muffled. And so that will really, as I turn that up for the harp, it'll change the sound of the brass. So we will never use shotguns. We'll stay to a hypercardioid. Sometimes if we can get just the right angle, we'll use the null of a bidirectional because there's a really, really big null in a bidirectional. So that can be useful.
Good, Todd. And then Tucker.
Yeah, just to piggyback on Jeff, because I know this question will come up in Mukana. Which hypercardioid? And most of I mean, we're seeing a whole lot of DPA 4099s on stage. We've used them in the violin world forever, and those are quite good isolationally.
Yep, a couple right over here. Go ahead, Tucker.
Yeah, that's part of. So you work toward isolation to a point, but again, if you get to where you're miking so close that the instrument is just right there next to your ear, then part of it is, and this is part of the art of being an engineer doing that job, is being able to accept, okay, I'm going to pick up this other instrument, and how is that going to affect my overall mix? And then part of that is using the same microphones or a uniform microphone type that has a particular signature across the board. For the most part, really, really helps so that when you do get bleed, it fits into the overall picture that you're trying to paint.
Next question. Oh, good. Jeff, before we jump. Or is that? Are you ready for the next question?
No. I want to finish about the distance from microphones. There's a thing called the mature sound field, where basically you get far enough away from an instrument that it sounds like that instrument. So think about your church choir with 50 people in it. If you walk up and stand right in front of Bob, it's going to sound like Bob. It's not going to sound like a blended choir. You have to move farther away. Well, same thing with a microphone. You put a microphone right at Bob's mouth, that's not going to sound like a choir. It's going to sound like Bob. So you move farther away. Well, when you go to pick up a harp, if you go too extremely close to the harp, it's not going to have a blend. Certain notes of the harp are going to be louder than others. So we have to stay somewhat distant away. So we move, and it generally, it tends to be you want a 1-to-3 ratio, that the closest, if you're a foot away from the closest thing, the farthest part shouldn't be more than 3 feet away. And that gets you within that close enough, but not too close. Again, so you're not, like Tucker's saying, it doesn't sound like it's right in your face. And that gets you a more natural sound of the instrument, which is going to blend with everything else.
Next question.
Rajan Chandel in Los Angeles asks, how do the iPads used in these settings sync the sheet music? Does each performer have the ability to scroll back or forward on those apps?
Good, Carl.
Depends on the musician. Some use a foot switch, forward and backwards foot switch. It's very simple. It's usually one iPad between 2 people in the string section. So in the horn section, it may be 1 per person if they're using iPads. A lot of people will just go back to paper because it never fails.
I always think it's funny when you listen to recordings and every once in a while you can hear the paper going, coming across. Go ahead, Talak.
As a lighting designer, I want the whole world to move to iPads. Thank you.
Go ahead, Todd.
A couple of things. One is, so first of all, as somebody who's been living this life for quite a while, this is what it looks like. coming off of an iPad. And just to give you a sense of like, if you, Carl's right, we all use foot pads when we're playing the violin because we don't have hands to use. But just a touch will take us. I don't know how well you can see that if I'm.
It was like turning the page.
Yeah, turning the page. You just go forward. And also annotation is really easy on these things. So I wanted to show you that, and then also another thing, which is very interesting to me, and I don't know why I can't get back to my regular view here. But anyway, I do. Here we go. Sorry. So the other thing was interesting as I worked with a great media company called 410 Media the other day. I've worked with them a lot, and they make beautiful videos. And for the first time, they came over to me and said, "Hey, can you just change the color on your iPad?" And I said, "What do you mean?" And they came over, and with the slider inside the settings on the iPad, they completely just tuned it right in to their color, to their light color on their light mats. And Tlaloc he knows all about this. And this was the first time that I'd worked with them that we'd done this. We were in kind of a dark room, and it was awesome. I just saw the color on the iPad shift to exactly the color that they tuned the room to. It was just great.
Tlaloc?
We did a couple of shows inside of a catacomb in a cemetery in Brooklyn, and the lights were really, really low, and the musicians were gracious enough to play inverted on their iPads, so they're mostly black. It was.
That's what I was going to ask you: is did they ever invert it to reduce that light? So every once in a while, if you ask nicely, it seems like the answer. Next question.
Really, really.
Yeah, exactly. There's cookies later. Next question.
Daniel Goldstein in Washington, D.C. says, what and how do you communicate with other stakeholders in the project? Do you communicate and plan with the post-recording mixer, conductor? What questions need to be asked?
Go ahead, Jeff.
I definitely talk with the conductor, talk about what music, the repertoire they're performing, talk about layout. Generally, there's a standard way that orchestras are laid out. Oftentimes, I may ask to move the horn section from directly behind over to stage right so that they appear in the audience left, and I kind of get some antiphonal things going on, some stereo action. The horns are on the left, the brass are on the right. But any kind of those questions, you have to build trust, and you have to be really sure that you are not messing up music. And that's really the most important thing, that if you ask them to make a change, you have to be sure that that does not affect the way they're going to perform music. So with a piano concerto, the piano is going to sit out in front of the orchestra. And so moving that piano even a foot away from the orchestra changes the way the pianist and the conductor interact with each other and the way they play music. So I'm always worried about that. And that's the most important thing in communication, is that the musicians and the conductor who plays the instrument of the orchestra, that they understand that you have the music as your first most interest.
Next question.
Matt Cool in Montreal, Quebec. He says, can you explain why placing a stereo pair of mics in an X pattern is a standard way to record an orchestra?
Good, Carl.
So this might be a good time for me to do my little 3 to 4 minute presentation. So I've put together a little baseline for everyone. So some people may not have an understanding of exactly how an orchestra is laid out, as Jeff was saying, putting the horns on the left, audience's left. So I'll start my presentation. It goes for about 2 or 3 minutes, but hopefully it will generate some more questions in Meccano as well.
Go for it.
All right, so what I'm showing here is an 80-piece orchestra. The 80-piece orchestra generally is a medium-sized orchestra, would consider that for these days, in the fact that 80-piece orchestra is probably a medium, as far as a 100-piece orchestra would be large, and a 40-piece orchestra would be relatively small. So the sections of the orchestras would be the strings. They will sit at the front closest to the conductor. Here I've got them arranged with first violins in green, second in yellow, and the violas in orange, cellos in pink, and the double basses in purple. There was a point in time in Europe where the pink and the yellow were interchanged. So cellos were there and the second violins were on the right, but in the American standard and for recording standard these days, it's laid out like this. So the woodwinds can generally be directly in front. So the flutes, oboes, clarinets, and bassoons, they will generally be in front of the conductor, straight ahead. In my setting, I've got the same as what Jeff has said, putting the French horns to the audience's left. So you get a stereo effect with the brass on the right. And at the back, we'll have percussion. So percussion can take up the entire back depending on how large the percussion ensemble is. So that kind of constitutes what a symphony orchestra is. Now, as far as a microphone, I've put a microphone where the conductor is. So the way we represent a microphone sometimes when we deal with orchestras and want to lay out and map it out is just a circle with a line. The line is going to be the microphone facing forward, even if it's an omni. So the different types of microphones, which I'm sure some of the people here would be aware of, condensers are probably the most commonly used in an orchestra setting. There's two flavors of those. So there's a tube type and the FET type, which is a transistor type. Dynamic microphones can be used generally in the percussion section, sometimes also in the brass section, and ribbons are commonly found in the brass section as well. So as far as the patterns, we have omni patterns. So we have the cardioid patterns, and as Jeff said before, harpocardioid would be one of those. And then the figure eights, so the bidirectionals, which do have excellent 90-degree axis rejection, which comes in very handy when you want to isolate certain groups. So if we put one microphone in the center, that'll just be a single omni. So no stereo image. So this is how orchestras recorded back in the 30s up until stereo recording came along, which happened in the 30s as well. So a spaced omni pair, you'll sometimes see these permanently fixed sometimes in some venues, like houses of worship, they'll hang them from the ceiling and they'll have a permanently fixed omni pair so they can record no matter what. So omni pairs, generally, they're two omni microphones, generally 90 centimeters apart. It may seem wide, but there's a reason for that when we get to the other types of stereo or two microphone setups. So another two microphone setup would be the ORTF, which is a French acronym. These are designed essentially to mimic the distance between the ears, so 17 centimeters at 110 degrees. Some people used to put like a soundproofing baffle between them, but that's generally not done these days. There is another version of this. They both use cardioids on those as well. The other version of this is NOS pair, which is 30 centimeter space. It's a bit wider. It gives you a bit wider of an image, and then 90 degrees, pointed at 90 degrees. Then when we go to the XY pair, which we just talked about, so the XY pair would be at 90 degrees with two cardioids, but they actually can go out to 135 if you want to get a bit more spatial pairing. You'll usually go to 135 if you're going to be putting with other mics. The other mics you're going to put it with is going to be a Decca tree. So Decca tree is the heart of recording an orchestra for a certain size, but even ensembles too, even chambers will use a small Decca tree. So the Decca tree was developed in the 1950s by audio engineers from Decca Recording. So essentially what a Decca tree does is essentially there are three omnis. There's usually used is the M50 by Neumann. The M50s aren't made anymore. They have a general characteristic where they're omnidirectional with the lower frequencies, and the upper frequencies have a slight cardioid pattern. So the distances I've measured out here, this is generally agreed upon, but it's depending on the space. So the room will dictate if you need to go a little bit larger with this triangle or a little bit smaller. But this is generally the smallest you'll go with a Decca tree. You may go a little bit larger depending on the room you're in. The other thing you have to know is height. So I'm not putting in heights in any of these because, again, that's room dependent. But the Decca tree would be at least 3 meters high, and it can get up to 4 meters high. So the Decca tree plus the outriggers, which is the left and right here, that's how most stereo recordings you've ever heard on CD, that's how they're recorded generally, with a couple of spot mics. But most of the recordings that they went through in Europe and put into onto CD back in the 90s, late 80s, early 90s, this was their pattern of recording. 8-channel recording, which is quite common back in the early days of digital, of CDs. They would put another microphone into the double bass section. As Jeff said before, you're putting two spot mics into woodwind sections because they're not as loud as the brass section or the horn section or percussions. But if you do that, you'll have to put gobos in. So when you're in a recording, this won't happen in a live situation generally, maybe with clear perspex. Vienna Symphony Orchestra does this sometimes, but in a recording studio, you'll put these 8 feet high gobos in that will go the entire length of the woodwind section, and that'll shield the microphones in the woodwind section from the brass, the very sharp and loud brass section, and the horns to an extent as well. When you go out to 16 channels, you're going to be spot micing definitely the harp. You're going to be spot micing the percussion and the timpanis. The tuba will have one above, so the bell for the tuba actually points up. So there's usually a condenser microphone up the top there. And then you'll notice down the bottom here, we've actually added 2 more microphones to the Decca tree. So that's the OF pair. So sometimes these can be pointing in, sometimes they can be pointing out, picking up the reverb from the room, again, that's up to the room itself and how you actually want to pick up the ambience. So the ORTF pair will usually pick up more ambience. Decatry will pick up some ambience, and then the outriggers for the Decatry as well. I'll go back one. So these are Omni for the Decatry and Cardioid for the ORTF pair. And then when we go into like a 16, we also must have to think about the French horns. The French horns, their bell points towards the back. And if you're in a recording situation, in a live situation, you would leave it clear and their sound would bounce off that back wall towards the audience. In a recording situation, we don't want that. So we're going to put in another gobo up there because we don't want these double sound, like a double echo from the French horns coming in. So that's actually just to absorb the sound. It hits a mic, but doesn't come back again. And then in more modern recordings, so 24 channel recording, and this is where I'm sitting at the moment, I have the equipment pretty much right now to record this setup, is you spot mic the clarinets, the flutes, oboes and bassoons, one mic each. It's at about 2.6 to 3 meters high. They're actually quite high. The harp is a bit more closer, but it's still about a meter away from the harp. It's not right on top of the harp. The trumpets is the trickiest. So the trumpets and the brass section, that's usually going to be either out the front, but a little bit away, so maybe 1.5 meters away, or it's going to be up above, so the equal distance between the trumpets and the trombones, if you think that, because normally you'd have your trombones on risers. And then if you take a look around the first desk, these are the closest in string section. There is a microphone for each of the principal strings, so the principal on the first, second, viola, and cello. So they will usually play solos in the strings. And it's the same with the woodwinds too. So up there in the center with the flutes, the oboes, bassoons, and clarinets, those mics will pick up the solos that will happen within an orchestra. So that's it.
That's fantastic. A very, very, very good use of Keynote. We tell people not to use slides, except when Carl uses slides, and then we tell people to use slides all the time. So, it's fantastic. I mean, really, I feel like I just had a master's class in recording in 4 minutes, but that's exactly what we hope to keep doing. Thank you so much. That was a lot of work, Carl. So thank you so much for doing that. Go ahead, Jeff.
Carl, that was amazing. Awesome. Thank you so much. Talking about those sort of main 3 stereo mic techniques you talked about. So if we start with XY, those microphones are at the same point in space. So the left and right mic get all sounds at the same time. And then as you begin to add space between the mics, then you begin to add in time difference between the 2 channels. That makes better stereo. However, it can also mess up mono. So XY is called coincident, and you will never have any mono compatibility problems. But generally, it only works in really great sounding rooms because it doesn't help a bad sounding room at all. Generally, more spacing between the mics gives you more spaciousness. It gives you additional reflections. It makes a room sound better than it is. Because XY is coincident, and then the near coincidence, that DIN, that ORTF, sorry, you didn't show DIN, but NOS, the ORTF, and another one is DIN, that's the German standard, puts cardioids close together within 30 centimeters of each other. There's a little bit of spacing there, but still has to use directional microphones in order to get amplitude differences, level differences between the left and the right. The reason why we love spaced omnis, and we have to put them far apart because you get no level difference between them, is because the only way to get full frequency response down to and below 20 hertz is an omnidirectional microphone. Cardioids will not pick up low frequencies evenly. When you speak close to a cardioid mic, you get a real big bass boost. But when you move far away from it, as we're doing all distant miking in orchestral recording, there's no low frequencies picked up by the microphones. It's hard to get below 50 hertz in a cardioid, so we have to use omnis. In order to use omnis, we have to put space between them.
That's great. Stuart?
2 quick questions for Carl. One from the chat is a request to put that in a PDF format in Discord because it was awesome. One for myself is, how do you add keyboards such as a grand piano or a harpsichord into that sort of setup?
So that's something I chose not to put in this slide because I try to keep it basic, because that's actually getting into miking up soloists. So as you notice here, I didn't actually put in any soloists, even though I've got groups in there. I didn't put in soloists because that again would be another 5 or 10 minutes I'd need to go through. And I chose not to do that for this particular talk, just so we can go through as many questions as we can. But there are 3 or 4 different ways to mic up a piano. And in a recording session, you do all 3 or 4 at the same time. So the mix engineer can just choose which one they want. You'd have close mics, which are actually hanging over into the grand piano. You'd have ones that are probably about 1 meter away from the grand piano. You'd have ones in the room, if you've got a nice room, picking up the piano's room. And if you're adventurous, you'd put some omnis underneath the piano, picking up those deep bass notes.
Hosmo?
I'm not musical at all, but the only comment I have is that Carl ups the ante every day on his knowledge. It's just unbelievable. I'm just, you should have a 24/7 radio, Carl.
It's call radio. All right, next question.
This one's coming in from Douglas Carmichael. He says, if you are merging orchestral sounds with synthesizers, do you use a different strategy for miking/mixing? And he says, I think that you'd want less bleed between sections to make processing easier.
Yeah, go ahead, Carl.
Yeah, so this was actually done in the late 60s. So Leonard Bernstein brought up a Moog modular synthesizer onto stage, and this was for the Kids Day, so to show the kids what the orchestra is. He brought up a Moog, thought it was really cool. It can be done, but it's mixed by the sound reinforcement mixer. So as Jeff said, there are sound reinforcement mixers for orchestras, and the person who would handle the blend of that will usually be the conductor or the music director, in some cases, with the sound mix engineer, so the sound reinforcement engineer.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Oftentimes, synthesizers or orchestras play with electronics. They will actually put speakers behind the orchestra so that they sort of make these electronic elements be an acoustic element along with that.
Yeah, it's actually one of the things that I've been this is how I got into really how we started talking about all this recording orchestras is trying to figure out how to change the position or at least adjust the position of some of the instruments, and figuring out that I had no idea what I was talking about. So we're learning from everyone here. Next question.
Sam Heichelbeck in Columbus asks, as a clarinetist, I find it difficult to capture the instrument's overtones, which operate differently than other woodwinds. I often don't think I sound the same on a recording as I do in real life. What is the best way to create an authentic recording?
Go ahead, Carl.
So yeah, clarinets, just like oboes and bassoons, you want to essentially going to get 2 different sounds. You're going to get one out of the bell, and you're going to get one that comes off probably where your lower hand is, a bit more perpendicular to the actual instrument. So that's a resonant sound of a clarinet, which is a wood sound, which sounds quite nice, the same as a flute has it as well. So you want to probably put 2 microphones, one at the bell, probably about 2 to 3 feet away from the microphone, from the bell of the clarinet, and then another one 90 degrees to that, pointing directly at your lower hand on the clarinet. It can be a little bit closer. So that one, if you're going to have one at the bell, it's going to be 3 feet away. The one close to your lower hand will be about 2 feet away. Then you can choose how you want to mix them in. The bell will have the higher end, more harmonics, whereas the one that's pointing at your hand a bit 90 degrees to the instrument will have more fundamental.
Next question.
Michael J. in New York City says, can you speak to your mic techniques when electronic instruments such as bass, guitar, synth, and drums are included in an orchestral performance?
I think we kind of covered that. Go ahead, Carl, real quick.
Yeah, as Jeff said, so when you do have guitars in there, generally you're going to have a nice amplifier, and that amplifier is going to be put somewhere in the corner where it's actually mixed in with the rest of the orchestra nicely.
Next question.
Douglas Carmichael asks, have you ever used plugins like the Waves primary source expander? He's got a link here, and it says to minimize bleed from neighboring sources on individual channels.
No, not tried that one.
Yeah, we've got to play with. Yeah, next question.
And Pruitt asks, bands sometimes record their concert performances for albums, but what about an orchestra? Is it often a symphonic orchestra records an outdoor performance for an album instead of in a controlled studio?
Go ahead, Tucker.
It's pretty unlikely that they're going to want the sound of an outdoor performance unless it's in a really nice shell, because again, the space is so much a part of the instrument. I mean, you're sitting inside the instrument. So
yeah. Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, but if you're recording, if they're performing in a concert hall, it's very common that performance gets recorded. That's what I did Saturday night, was a orchestra live stream and recording. And going back to the question about piano miking, what I did for that, because it was also video, is 2 of the DPA 4099s on, actually I had 4 because there were 2 pianos. It was a double piano concerto. So those were highlighting the piano inside, little magnetic mount that just sits inside there. And those are hypercardioids, sort of in an ORTF configuration. So, 17 centimeters apart.
Good. Talak?
In opera, we have this problem of always having these pesky sets. And so and they're designed in different ways, and they have huge effects on the acoustics of the room. It's one of the reasons that opera orchestras tend to be put in the pit, because it's a common denominator, and it plays the instrument in a particular way that is less disruptive when there's a different kind of set. COVID threw that all on its head, because we couldn't put any of the people in the pit. We had to put them on stage, then have some sort of separation between them and the singers, and the acoustic balance and the acoustic metrics just kind of got thrown on its head. So now we're having conversations in design meetings like, well, what is that going to do to the string section if there's a piece of wood right there? Just something to keep.
Next question.
Tucker asks, how do you manage time domain differences between your section mics and primary arrays?
Go ahead, Jeff.
Delay the close mics so that they actually want them to fall behind the primary array. So when you think about, you have an oboe player sitting in the woodwind section, there's a mic a meter away from them. The main mics, which are the primary sound, might be 5 meters away from them. So there's a big time difference there.
And 5 meters is probably what, 15 milliseconds?
Yeah, maybe even more than that. Probably closer to 20 or 25. If my 5 meters, sorry, my metric system's not so good. The oboe is probably going to be farther than that from the main array. About 1 foot per millisecond is a good start as a rule of thumb. So the sound of the oboe is going to get to that close mic much sooner. And your ear will always localize to the first wavefront. So you want to put the close mic behind the oboe sound arriving at the distant mic. That way, all of the timbre and directionality of the distant mic, which is going to be the overall blend, your ear's going to hear that. And then you're able to increase the level of the oboe with the spot mic, but not put it right in your face.
Because the thing we always have to remember, we've talked about this in the past, is that where things are in our mind are based on time. And so we picture things in is not the loudness, it's the time it takes to get from one ear to the other. Carl?
Yeah, so the closest a spot mic will generally be, with the exception of a soloist, would probably be about 2.5 to 3 meters above and about 2.5 to 3 meters in front. So there is going to be a time delay. As Talak said, if you're going to have, or Tucker said, if you're going to have a microphone like less than 1 meter away, that's the only time I've ever seen that is like on a brass section for like a big band. They'll be like 50 centimeters to 1 meter away for a big band on ribbon mic. But for orchestral stuff, it's generally you can change it with the room, but generally 2.5 to 3 meters up and maybe 2 meters in front.
Jeff?
Until you get into amplification of those instruments, and then you're looking at things that are much closer. In fact, what Todd was talking about is microphones mounted sort of a few inches above his violin.
Go ahead, Tucker.
Yeah, Jeff, I really appreciated you showing that picture of how you mic the grand piano and the differences between how you mic the grand piano for recording, where you've got kind of that they have some space between the soundboard and the mics, versus what we would do for amplification, where you're going to have it much closer down on the string bed. It's very, very interesting. Thank you.
Question.
Victor Cahiao asked, when you are mixing the orchestra in a multi-track project, do you place the stereo field from the point of view of the audience or the musicians?
Good, Carl.
For the point of view of the conductor. So, which could be the front row of the audience, you could think that as well. But the conductor is conducting the orchestra, and he's controlling dynamics from where he or her is standing. So from the conductor's point of view, and this is why the decker tree will sit directly above the conductor on hopefully a strong stand, because if that falls, it's pretty heavy.
I know this isn't directly related, but I think that for a lot of people, it'd be good for you to describe the conductor's role. I think a lot of people think of the conductor as keeping time, but it's a lot more than that, right?
So I just worked with an orchestra who had 4 different conductors coming for 4 different pieces, and that's because it's a community orchestra, and each person could. So that it was really cool how they did that, and I could see how they're different. But dynamics is one, timing is one. So sometimes before Beethoven, there was no time signature, there was no number. It was just play slowly, play fast, in Italian. But Beethoven was the person who went, no, I want a number here. I want to go 98 beats per minute, and because I want to see that. So before Beethoven, Baroque music is completely conductor driven, because they're just Italian words, and then it say slowly, fast, or speed up or slow down. The conductor is the one who will choose that crescendo, how to speed up, how to slow down, and also the dynamics, when to bring sections in. So a section may come in, they may come in light, and then he'll say, okay, now build up, build up, build up, build up. And so he's playing with dynamics and timing completely with the whole orchestra. And the percussion guys at the back, some people kind of forget about them, but the percussion guys have these kind of trills that will be enormously in dynamics. So extremely quiet on a timpani to the loudest singing in the orchestra, back to being the quietest. And that's a conductor controlling that trill on a timpani as well.
Go ahead, Todd.
I am super happy to say that conductors are your best traffic cop. They are Alex Lindsay. They are anybody who is a leader and decides to work in this domain. Some of the most phenomenal things you could ever see are videos of Leonard Bernstein conducting the orchestra. For a big contrast to that, Herbert von Karajan, who in his later years especially, barely moved his hands. But a conductor can hold up an entire line of traffic, can inspire, can move music in a way that nothing else can. And I wondered when I was going to bring this up, but I think I should bring it up now. And that is that we are all playing. What is a sound system? A conductor isn't even playing an orchestra. A conductor is playing a sound system, and that sound system is the building in which that orchestra is playing. This is the same for Tlaloc and opera. A singer, an opera singer, fills that hall and is playing that sound system, which originally was architecture. And the one thing that Carl didn't say that I wanted to fill in was that back in Haydn's day, a conductor had a big pole with which he at that time would pound time on the stage, and people would play along. So back in that time, conductors were kind of beginning to evolve past that into something more subtle and nuanced.
Tlaloc?
In our world, this doesn't happen often, but it's magical when the conductor is thinking not only about the sound system that you talked about, Todd, but also about the story that is being told. And when and where there are a little bit more breath or a moment of not action necessarily, but of understanding to happen. And when that conversation happens in the rehearsal room, it is magical. I get goosebumps thinking about it.
Good, Jeff.
Most people think of the conductor just during the concert, but before that, they've been diving into and living and breathing and eating this music, and they understand it backwards and forwards. And then the rehearsal process is really where their skill comes out. They hear things, they find mistakes in the parts, they bring out the voicings of the chords the way that they hear that music should be. And that's where a lot of the magic of the conductor is. And so getting to sit in a rehearsal and hear a conductor or a choir director or an opera director put these things together is just a great experience.
When do we get to do that? When do we get to stream that? That's the only thing that I want to know is if any of you guys have that, we're ready. That's all I'm saying. We're ready. Next question.
Thomas Chance in St. Paul, Minneapolis asks, what are your favorite stereo pair mics, LCD, Sheps?
Go ahead, Jeff.
DPA 4006s. Small diaphragm condenser.
Cole's ribbon microphones.
Yep. Go ahead. Hassan, did you? Oh, okay. No. Next question.
Chuck Wojak in Concord, California asks, at what point in an orchestral recording do you focus on the mix as if they were in the audience versus as if there was in a recording studio, i.e. hearing every nuance of each instrument versus a balance as if in person?
Go ahead, Carl.
This really goes into what Alex is interested in, spatial audio. So it depends how many channels you want to reproduce it at. So that's the whole point. We want to capture every nuance of the orchestra, and then the mix engineer and the mastering, well, the mix engineer will decide the balance and the mastering engineer will decide where. So whereabouts in that balance they will go. So it depends on, there's a whole chain of people there. One person could try it all, but it would be a bit too much. But there's a whole chain of people there who make that decision on what part to bring up, what part not to bring up, as far as what to make louder, what not to make louder, what to make more present as well, and what to come from room mics. And also in spatial audio, this is going to be a very fun adventure we're going on, because I think symphonies with spatial audio is going to be a lot of fun, with especially when soloists come in.
Yeah, Jeff?
It all starts from the score. So from the music, I'm looking at the score and working with the conductor about what lines need to come up.
Next question.
Daniel Goldstein asks, before COVID, live mixing a stream of an orchestra probably didn't happen that often, but with the shift to online, how would you mix a whole orchestra for remote listening?
Go ahead, Todd.
I mean, I would just start with the stereo pair that Jeff Francis started the whole beginning of the session with. That's more than enough to give a beautiful image through original sound, through Zoom, or through any streaming that you want to do.
Go ahead, Carl.
Yeah, I watched the Memorial Day Royal New York Philharmonic. So they had spot mics on every single musician, and they were spaced for COVID reasons. They did have an omni pair at the front, but essentially every person was just spot mic'd. It was a single mic for every person and an omni pair at the front. That was it.
You go, Tucker.
Yeah, that's basically, I've done several operas since COVID started, and that was what I wound up doing, was spot mics on just about everything, but leaning extremely heavily on my front row set of microphones that were just catching the opera singers and the overall sound, and then just barely pushing the instruments to give them just a little bit of top end presence, and giving me some space to push them around. So yeah.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Did one Saturday, primary stereo pair, added in a pair above the woodwinds up, 3 meters like Carl was talking about. And then for the pieces that had piano spots. So the most it was 8 mics, some subtle reverb added in to make the concert hall sound a little better. Definitely some bus compression for stream, but very, very subtle in that regard.
Next question. I'm sorry, Todd. Go ahead, Todd. Last thing.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to just insert, as an orchestra player and as a listener of classical music all my life, the sound engineer and these choices that Jeff might make or that Carl might make, these choices that they make, they are artists themselves in this choice. And it really does have more to do with how we hear the music than, obviously, I mean, this is obvious, but it has more to do with listening to the music than anything else. So it's really interesting to hear. I mean, it seems like for Carl, when he thinks about or for the New York Philharmonic with the spot mics, these are all backup things, but really the art's being made just in the final mix of what these guys are hearing. It's their ears that have us listen to what we listen to.
Tucker, real quick, we're going to start moving fast.
Yeah, you have to really decide, are you putting people in a seat in the room, or are you putting them at the conductor's position, or how is the audience going to be feeling and hearing it? And it kind of depends on, for the opera, we were doing close-ups and cuts of the performance, which you may place the music a little bit differently in that situation. You may bring it more around the performance versus putting the audience back in a seat. If it's wide back of the room shot with a couple of close-ups, you might lean the other direction. So,
next question.
Yeah, you want to take the last one? Guy was tossing it off to me because he's got a request. He's got something else to do. Robert Barrow, Plymouth Meeting, Pennsylvania, says, what's the best way to mic each of these? A violin, a flute, and a cello?
I think we had a preamp one before that. So there was Roberto or Victor asked, what kind of preamps are you using to record orchestral music? Go ahead, Carl.
I'm personally using tube-based preamps. You don't have to. I also have tube microphones. So these are tube microphones going to tube-based preamps. But the quality of preamps these days and the quality of microphones these days, you can actually get quite a lot of good. It's more about the flavor of microphone you want and the flavor of preamp rather than the quality.
Yeah, go ahead, Jeff.
I would just say clean, transparent gain. Millennia would be my first choice.
Next question.
Then we're off to the best way to mic each of these: a violin, a flute, and a cello.
Go ahead, Carl.
So for soloists, there's an AB pair. So you'd have two microphones spaced about 30 centimeters apart. They're going to be raised for, let's say, for a violinist, they're going to be above head height and they're going to be pointing directly at the soundboard, perpendicular to the soundboard. For a flute, it's going to be perpendicular to the flute itself. It's not going to be coming out of the actual bottom of the flute. It's going to be perpendicular to the flute itself. And for a cello, it's going to be at about knee height and it's going to be a cardioid. It's going to be pointed halfway between the bridge and the F hole, probably at about a meter away.
That's great. Good answer. Next question.
Tlaloc Lopez Waterman says, do you ever mic further away, i.e. back of the audience, or a room mix for a room mix channel, or is that just chaos in this?
Go ahead, Carl.
Yeah, so this is where the Decatree comes in. So the Decatree really is, so that's the one down the front here. So the Decatree really is the mic of choice when you want to get that whole room. So if you take a look at any recording for a film, you'll notice I'll have a Decatree in there because there's no audience. It's a prepared space. And you can have XYs actually further back in the room and Omni pairs way back in the room to maybe mix up that reverb if you want natural reverb in the room.
Go ahead, Tucker.
Yeah, and in Carl's diagram, he did talk about sometimes you would have one of the pairs forward and sometimes you'd put them back, pointed back at the room. So typically if I'm picking up a room sound, it's still at that center front position, but pointed back and mainly picking up the room.
Good, Jeff.
If you put your ambient mics too far back in the room, then you get a slapback echo. So they need to stay somewhat close. Another great option is bidirectionals facing sideways so that their null is facing toward the group. So one pointed to the left, one pointed to the right.
Next question.
Andy Lipnick in San Francisco, friend of ours, says, with larger multiple mic setups, how do you manage phase time differences between the mics?
Yeah, go ahead, Carl.
Yeah, so that's all the pairs that me and Jeffrey have been talking about. So the Omni, the spaced Omnis and the Decatrees, these are tried and tested. They've in the 17 centimeters and the 30 centimeters. And AB pairs, which are generally pointed in parallel. So these are known, and the tone meister, the person in charge of the microphones for the recording, will be to the millimeter with the microphones. They'll be listening in and finding out. But these are tried and tested results from the last 60, 70 years.
Next question.
Ranjan Sanjil in Los Angeles asks, would you record the same way for finishing in Dolby Atmos?
I think that's the thing we're wrestling with is where to go. I mean, I do think that after listening to the thought process here is building a bed with the mics that are in the orchestra and then figuring out how to pull the soloists out to put them in certain places seems to be the thing. Go ahead, Jeff, and then Carl real quick.
There are some specialized surround mic arrays that take sort of Decatree and go on beyond that for 5.1 and 7.1. So working in Atmos, you'd probably need that as a minimum for your bed, and then lots of ability to have spot mics. But also, it depends on if you're going to want to take, the flute solo and fly it, because if that person is standing in a 5.1 or a 5-channel microphone array, then their imaging is fixed in that array, and so you don't have the ability to fly them around. So you have to really start from the concept of what you want to do in Atmos.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that I'm looking at for that is to take some of these MIDI tracks and just mix it, play with the mix of what I want, with a raw MIDI version, just so I can visualize where that would look like, and then figure out how we do that in the real world. Carl?
I think another big thing that can happen too is there's a Sennheiser twin microphone, which is you can change the polar pattern after the fact. It simply records the 2 audio channels. And if you put twin microphones, these Sennheiser twin microphones, pretty much, at every location that I've showed here, then in the mix, you'll have maybe too much choice. That could be a thing. But yeah, so these Sennheiser twins where you can change the polar pattern after the fact can allow you to actually take a flute at hypercardioid like you're there and then switch it quickly to Omni from the exact same microphone, and you can put that from the front speakers to the rear speakers instantly from the same microphone, if that makes sense.
Tucker, real quick.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see how the art of mixing in Atmos and mixing in those environments, how that develops, because it seems to me, and Jeff and Carl definitely have a lot more experience here, but it seems to me like where you put the audience is part of, I mean, it's trusted by the conductor that I'm going to put the audience in this position and I'm going to represent what you're doing here, and getting into things that you might consider weird of flying an instrument or things like that that would take away from the overall piece. It'll be very interesting to see how that develops.
And I think it'll be an evolution. We went from theater, which, and suddenly we started moving the cameras all over the place, so I think it's the same thing. Go ahead, Jeff.
And I think you'll see music composed for Atmos. I mean, there's already all kinds of specialized music that comes with a rider where you need to put 8 speakers around the hall to do live electronic playback with musicians. So I think having a set Atmos blueprint, people will compose for that.
Yep. Next question.
Daniel Goldstein, Washington, D.C. Is there anyone with experience recording orchestral samples? Christian Henson of Spitfire Audio has a fantastic YouTube channel about this and other related subjects, he writes.
I think that's going to be one of the ways we visualize a lot of this is to do that. I think you still eventually want the musicians somewhere recorded, but I think that being able to have the samples helps you visualize what you're going towards. Next question.
Tlaloc Lopez Waterman says, Carl mentioned miking where the conductor stands. Does that help record the show that the conductor created?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Next question.
Leland Best, Corona, Michigan says, cornet trumpet player from back in the day, what would be the most appropriate way to mic a horn in a small 8x14 room, most likely being played with a mute most of the time?
Go ahead, Carl.
If you're playing with a mute, definitely have a microphone in front of you, maybe 2 to 3 feet, and definitely have a microphone probably about 2 meters above you, so above door height above you, to pick up the fundamentals and a bit of the room, and you can mix those two. But if you're playing with the mute, you want something closer to the mute, maybe 2 to 3 feet away from the mute, so you actually pick up those dynamics you're doing with your mute.
And I don't want to cut this off, but I have to drop out again, so I'm going to drop out. Someone should just I'll keep Discord open. Just ping me when you're done, and I'll open the post show. I just have to jump into another thing. So thanks. In fact, I'll open it now. You stay here, but I'll have it opened somewhere else. All right. I can't actually until the end.
Okay, we're moving on to Douglas Carmichael's question related to Ranjan's question. If you're using an iPad app to distribute music to each orchestral member, wouldn't you need some sort of central server to distribute the content? And wouldn't you need Wi-Fi infrastructure on site? Carl, what's happening with distribution of music?
So there are companies out there that actually have, there are apps, and you can actually do a subscription based to these apps where you can actually buy a full orchestra package, and that allows you to distribute that out. So there's actually full orchestra scores, which actually come bifurcated, and there's digital versions of this as well as paper versions.
So we're getting a lot of nods. So we're moving on to TJ Asher's question out of Minneapolis. How does the recording process for a CD album differ from recording a live performance with an audience? Do orchestras record in the same hall for a CD as they perform for the live audience? Jeff, go ahead.
So live, the most you're going to get is 2 takes, a dress rehearsal and the live concert. In an album recording, an orchestra is going to do many takes and do patches. So they're going to do a full take of a movement, probably 2 or 3 takes of a movement, and then go back with a musical producer who is following the score and listening and taking notes of what worked and what didn't, and go back and fix problem spots. And then an editor will edit all of that together. Yes, classical music is edited to death. Hundreds of takes is not unusual, and thousands of edits is not unusual.
Interesting. Douglas Carmichael's. Oh, Stuart, you want to pop in before we go to Douglas?
Yeah, I'd just like to have Jeff's feedback on how movie sound is recorded and movie orchestral pieces, where sometimes the players don't even see the music until they turn up to record it, and it's almost played on site without doing those multiple
really
takes.
Well. They sight read really well because they're professional musicians, and they do that all day, every day. And so that music gets dropped on their stand and off they go. Oftentimes they're hearing full MIDI mock-ups in their ears. So they're playing along with something that's already been sculpted to match the scene. composed to match that scene. And then sometimes these are all done on scoring stages, and oftentimes the brass and percussion are separated into other rooms or overdubbed at a different time. But again, it's that decatry is the primary thing in a good sounding recording scoring stage.
Let's go to Carl real quick and then Todd. Go ahead, Carl.
Yeah, so music for picture is completely different. So yeah, you're right. So what Jeff said, they're going to use sample libraries to actually create. The composer will create sample libraries so they can actually hear what it's going to sound like before they're spending money on these professional musicians who can play it sight read. They'll probably get maybe a week before they'll get the MIDI track, or they'll get the sample library version of the track, because it's going to be brand new music they've never heard it before. They'll get the sheet music on the day. So I do know that with Star Wars: The Phantom Menace Episode 1 back in 1999. They saw the music on the day when they rocked up. The one that was in the film was their third go at that recording. That playing that track was the one that was actually used in the film. So I did their third performance.
Todd, take us home.
Yeah, you can hear me on the Batman Returns soundtrack. Nobody's laughing. You won't hear me on the Batman Returns soundtrack, but I was totally on it. I just wanted to piggyback on Jeff to say that, you know, as somebody who has done a million of these soundtracks, the ability to sight read, which I learned very, very young by being thrown in the bathtub by Zubin Mehta's father in a youth orchestra, the American Youth Orchestra in LA. Because I learned that, it's been one of the most thrilling things that I ever get the chance to do, is sight read difficult music. And with my colleagues all together, we make it come out swinging on the first or second take. It's thrilling and it's exciting. It's an awesome experience.
Nice. Douglas Carmichael has the next question as well. Would classically trained musicians have challenges adapting to playing with rock, pop, or electronic bands, which require a fair amount of improvisation? Do those two styles, extemporaneous versus scored, make a difference? Carl and then Tucker.
Yeah, so Hans Zimmer's got a few documentaries where he's actually showing this, where he's playing his film scores with a mixture of classical musicians and some rock musicians, and they're playing together. So it's actually in the rehearsal rooms. So the documentary's like quite long, but the vast majority of the documentary is actually in the rehearsal room, and then figuring out how they're going to rearrange the music to suit the different styles.
And Tucker? No, was it Tucker or Todd? Right, everybody's got their hands up now. So let's go with Tucker and then Todd and then Stuart, then Talak. Go ahead, Tucker.
This is kind of a parallel, but one of my favorite events that I've ever done it was for a ballet group, and the ballerinas and all the dancers at the beginning of the event did amazing ballet, and then they moved over to a portion of the event that was just kind of, let's all dance on the dance floor. And it's a very similar parallel of they're not very good at just dancing on the dance floor.
They looked like they needed more structure than that. Is that what you're saying, basically? Interesting. Todd, then Stuart, then Talak to finish up. Go ahead, Todd.
When I began in New York 30 years ago in my career, I was one of only a few of my friends in classical music who also played rock and roll and jazz and interacted in this way and had learned some of that skill set. I can say now as a teacher in major conservatory that more and more of my folks that are coming up, especially in the avant-garde region where I teach, they've already played in rock bands and fiddle bands, and everybody brings a little bit of some other skill set in the room. When it comes to actually working together, most of the stuff that classical musicians are brought in to do is written, and they seek out specialists like myself who improvise as a living to do the other stuff. And I'll be happy to talk more about this on Thursday for sure, because what I tend to do is make music up from nothing.
Stuart, go ahead.
I just want to burst a few bubbles for all the pop fans out there. Some of the greatest musicians you've ever heard on the radio are classically trained.
I can imagine that. Talak, go ahead and take us home.
I just wanted to say that there's a real upsurgence of contemporary classical music and compositions that are happening now, and because we live in this space of listening to pop music and listening to rock and roll and listening to all kinds of hip hop, different kinds of things, the composers are hearing in their ears a multitude of different things to listen to. So sometimes a composer will want for it to sound a little bit more poppy, even though it's still in that classical music composition world. So again, it's is a common denominator with this whole show. What is the piece? What is meant for the piece to do, and how do we serve that?
Nice. The next question, Aaron Huslages from Durham, North Carolina, says, tell us about your mic setups. And I kind of want to go in two directions with this, maybe, if that works. Let's go through everybody we know who does this for a living and talk about what you have now and what you use. And if you were to get everything stolen and were to buy brand new, where would you go? And is that different or the same? Let's start with Carl, and then we'll go to Jeff and Todd and through the rest. Go ahead, Carl.
I wouldn't change much as far as where I'd put the mics. So the Decatree would come first, and then the outriggers, and then you do a little bit of spot mic on the woodwind. So that doesn't change much. It's just more miking you get gives you more chances. This is for recording only, not for sound reinforcement or live performance, but for recording only, where you control the space. But you can actually get away quite a lot with 2, 4, 5 microphones. That's all you kind of really need. A lot of CD recordings, people don't realize there was a whole wave in the late 70s of master recordings done with just 4 microphones. That was it.
But if you were going to go back, let's say your kit got stolen, would you go back to the DPAs you use now, or would you think about something else? Is there anything out there on the horizon you go, I'd like to try that?
If cost was no limit, then the Sennheiser Twins, which are $5,000 each. The only reason why is because they are every polar pattern anytime I want it. So after the fact, I can change the polar pattern from a hypercardioid to an omni. I can do that after I've recorded it. So that's one place to go. The other thing is the room. I'd probably spend way more money on a recording space than on microphones.
Understood. Jeff, what are your feelings about that? What do you use now, and what might you change to if you had the chance?
DPA 4006s, and as a main pair, I'd replace them with exactly that. And then spot mics, Sheps, Sennheiser, hopefully hypercardioid, a good pair of bidirectionals to do some bloom line or those kind of things.
Cool. Todd, what do you think?
Well, first of all, I don't record orchestras, so my kit's a little bit different. But if you want to hear it, just for reference, I recorded my record in 2011 with a Gefell TM70S as the mid, and a Coles 4040 for the sides. I record in mid-side pattern. That's something I'm sure that Jeff and Carl can both explain even better than I can, even though I do understand it. And as far as performance goes, I do use DPA 4099s. That's my drug of choice there. And I also amplify my fiddle with a Schertler pickup. Pickups measure the vibration of a surface rather than the vibration of airwaves around the instrument, so they come out much more compressed sounding no matter what you do in direct sounding. But that's how I do capture my violin, especially for using Insight software.
Tucker, what's your kit of choice as you walk into something for a orchestral type recording?
Yeah, I'm more geared toward live, and just through the pandemic got into doing some more of the broadcast style where you're in more of the recording setup. I use a lot of Audio-Technica stuff right now, and then Shure KSMs. I would definitely go with DPA full kit if I was going to buy something new.
And Talak, I know you work in live theater as much as anything else. Is there anything particular about your miking approach that would send somebody looking for something?
I don't work in recording things, so I'm going to step back on that question.
Okay, fair enough. I misapplied. So let's move on to the next question. Courtney Good from Hollywood is up next with, if you have to put in plexiglass perspex panels for isolation or for COVID requirements, how do you deal with the standing waves and other reflection issues that reflect the acoustics of the room full of plexiglass? Go ahead, Carl.
Yeah, so the shape of the orchestra kind of lends its hand here. So you can actually put in plexiglass and they don't have to be parallel. So as long as your plexiglass isn't parallel with another piece of plexiglass, you won't get the problem with the standing waves generally.
Is it generally non-parallel from the front or from the tops or both, or does it matter?
So sometimes you'll have like a horns, a brass section right behind a string section. So I'll actually have plexiglass between the two, so they're not blowing straight down onto. And then you'll have plexiglass between woodwind sections and the horn section or the brass section, and that's to separate the two in recordings. Sometimes if you're doing like Andre Rieu, who does cinematic recordings of his live performances where it's got to sound good in the cinema, he will actually have a lot of plexiglass set up, and also percussion too. There'll be plexiglass between the percussion and the rest of the orchestra sometimes as well.
Jeff?
Worse than the plexiglass panels was the 6-foot spacing. which took in orchestra, and that is already distant. I mean, the percussion section already knows to play ahead of the conductor's downbeat. They have to, because it's going to take their sound 30 or 40 milliseconds to get up to the conductor because they're so far back. Now we've spaced the entire orchestra out, and getting these musicians to play together, you just made their music so difficult. Same with choirs. Boy, I had, doing a 9-person choir, they would normally stand shoulder to shoulder in 2 rows, and now they're spaced out 6 feet, 6 feet, 6 feet. And so you need almost a microphone on each person to get any kind of definition on that choir.
Interesting. I have an oddball question for you. When you're playing in an orchestra, how much do you pay attention to the musicians around you as opposed to focusing on the conductor for your timing and the rest? Do you play as an ensemble with the other chairs around you in your section, or do you focus entirely on that central timekeeper? Jeff, I was specifically for you, but I'll take it from anybody.
They're listening to everything that's going on in the orchestra, because oftentimes, I mean, if you're a violinist in a violin section, you are playing the same part with a dozen other people. So you need to have your bowing, your intonation, your vibrato, your dynamics match as a section. But you may be also playing a line with the bassoon. And so you need to be listening to make sure that you're playing with that bassoon.
Thank you. That helps me. So you're listening to everybody, not just running off the conductor's signals to you. Todd, do you want to weigh in on this?
Carl, can you bring your keynote slide up of the orchestra one more time? So if you take a look at this, I was the first the first yellow person on the front row. Right. So I was principal second violinist of the Rochester Philharmonic for about 3 years. And it was my great pleasure and my joy to play with my colleagues. And my audition piece, where I actually was put in the orchestra for the last part of the audition, like "Do You Measure Up" type of thing, was "The Rite of Spring" by Igor Stravinsky. It is a rockin' piece. And Jeff is absolutely correct. We are listening to every single thing. What's really interesting also to explore, and the reason I wanted to speak, was being the leader of a section, right? You have 4 leaders of the string section. You have the concertmaster, who's the leader of the orchestra by title, the principal second, the principal violist, the principal cellist, the principal bassist. And our jobs are just to kind of be solid. We don't do anything in particular other than to just play our parts, kind of, and also use our bodies to indicate the way that we are understanding the communication from the conductor. But the conductor is literally right up there in front of me. So there is responsibility there. And so playing with the bassoons, playing with the clarinet, playing with the flute solo, all of these things I took on as my personal obligation and responsibility, that at least I had to offer something strong. And leadership, of course, as you all know, is not about sticking your head up out of the sand and saying, "Come with me," but more just trying to be powerfully in a situation. So that, combined with the listening, is the job of all the leaders of the orchestra, and every section of the orchestra has a leadership position.
Nicely said. Talak, you want to finish up with something?
We had a lot of struggles with COVID and trying to keep people separate. There's another instrument called the voice that is also there, and I will share a image if I can here. This is an opera that we did where everybody can see this, right? Yes. Where we literally are separating out the singers in vinyl boxes, and there was some thoughts that around how to keep negative airflow and all this stuff in the COVID world. And it was very, very hard for them to get used to hearing themselves as if they're in the shower, and how do they feel that they are connected with their fellow singers and their fellow instrumentalists in the orchestra. So, a lot of things got thrown up in the air, and we tried to catch.
Fascinating. Douglas Carmichael's up next. When with the University of Illinois Marching Illini went to the Macy's parade, one of the things the band observed was the New York Philharmonic rehearsal. Coming from rock and pop, wouldn't you want rehearsals to be closed? I know Rock Litless touts its privacy. I don't quite understand that last part, but what about something like, what perspective would you think a marching band would have looking at a philharmonic rehearsal? What would they take away, Carl?
So musicians respect other musicians, just full on. Also, it's up to the conductor whether it's going to be an open dress rehearsal or not. So the conductor will say, invite these people in, and sometimes it's a very good thing to do for the New York Philharmonic and a marching band to show, because they have similar skills, but they can show these skills in this kind of dress rehearsal. So it is a nice peek behind the curtain before the main show, probably the next day.
Okay, Rachel Ann Clifton is next with our getting down to the last 4 questions. How involved is the conductor in these decisions, and or when are they invited into the design sequence conversation? Anybody want to pop in on that? I mean, I would suppose it depends in part on Carl and Jeff. Let's do Carl first and then Jeff.
So the conductors that I work with, being community conductors, they're just happy to have their performances recorded and their versions, their arrangements, because a lot of times they're working with small orchestras, we have to rearrange. So their arrangements recorded. So this is actually their hard work being recorded as well. So I work very closely with them to know where solos may have been moved. So they may have to move solos. And during the dress rehearsals, I'm paying very sharp attention to the changes that are being made. So when you see musicians quickly scribbling on their scores to changes, I'm taking note of that as well, to know that maybe a microphone needs to be put over there because someone else is taking over a small solo that was meant to be on the other side of the orchestra.
Nice. Okay, Jeff, go ahead, and then Talak.
So the conductor, along with the musical producer, are the two that are most vested in the musical content. So they will be very involved in these decisions. They may or may not be involved in sound, except to listen and approve or give suggestions, because they may not be, microphone experts. But in a recording project, the conductor is very involved. The musicians may not be, because they may just be union musicians. They're there for a 3-hour session. They're getting their paycheck. They will get exactly that amount of money for this project, whether this particular project sells 1 copy or 1 million copies. They got their paycheck. The musical producer working for the record company and the conductor are the artistic people who care about, all the musicians care about the music, but they're the ones that are actually going to be involved in deciding which takes get used, how is the blend that the engineer is creating. So the conductor, I like to speak with the conductor because they know the music the best. So they're going to have the most ability to tell me, yes, that's the best take to use there. This take was not good. All those kinds of things.
Last.
So in opera, we really, really want the conductor to be there from day one. And there's times when that doesn't happen, and it's always a disaster because they just come in and then change everything. And so we want them to be there from day one. We also need them to have an assistant because they can only hear from their position in the pit, and we need them to be able to go walk to the back of the house, their assistants, and hear the balance and figure out if there's a weaker singer or that kind of thing. And then that gets brought over to the reinforcement engineers to make sure that there's things getting pulled out that need to get pulled out from the standpoint of the design and the standpoint of the conductor. And then that, just so we're not all about, I'm not talking only about reinforcement, that also goes into the recording of that particular opera, which happens almost on every one of them. And so there has to be, that has to flow forward into that design of how it gets recorded and what that recording is.
Nice. Douglas Carmichael, third to the last, is have any of you used phase alignment plugins like Waves in Phase to phase align sources to each other automatically? Jeff had his hand up immediately.
I've played with it just a little bit, and I've not found it to be a tool that I need. I'm very careful not to align them in phase perfectly. So if we go back to that example of the spot mic on the oboist, aligning that in time with as that sound gets to the main array, the problem is that oboe player moves. They sit in their seat, and as they're playing, they will rock back and forth. And if you are perfectly aligned in time, and then you move, and now you get the slightly out, you've created a flanger. And that's exactly what you don't want. So that's why putting the spot mic slightly behind, sometimes people say as much as 25%. If you need, 20 milliseconds to delay, you should actually If 20 milliseconds is the exact amount, you would put it at 25 milliseconds to put the close sound behind the sound that arrives at the main array. So that waves tool, I think, works great for things that are fixed in place. 2 mics on a guitar cabinet, several mics on a drum set. It doesn't work so well with musicians, human musicians that are moving around.
It's interesting to think. I didn't realize that the positional change as small as rocking back or rocking forward is audible with something like flanging and phase cancellation. I know that from microphones, but that's fascinating. It happens in
If you get them perfectly aligned, then you can get that problem.
Interesting. Stephen Richards of Ottawa, Ontario. Has anyone used sound field mics? You may have described what's inside. Are these used primarily in post to tweak a performance? Anybody want to talk about sound field mics? Oh, I think Jeff just put up a, so
Carl's
it's a
got his hand
multiple
up
mic
first.
elements in a same place. Go ahead, Carl.
So one place where these are used is in 3D. So anything that's recorded in 3D uses these microphones. The reason why is because it's a very directionality microphone. So you can actually, in post, you can actually use software to swing around and listen to a different direction. It's not changing the polar pattern generally. It's going to be changing the direction you're hearing sound from. So that's why it's used in 3D video, where you can actually use these. Putting them into an orchestra is a little bit interesting. I think you can use them creatively, but changing the direction a microphone will sound, I think, would be better. Maybe if you put it right in the center of the string section, put like a line of them through the center of the string section, and you could play with it there. But it's more of experimentation, and that's what all microphoning is in symphonies. Is we've all done experimentation and found what works best. But still, we're going to experiment with these new techniques as well.
Nice. Jeff, go ahead, finish.
So sound field mics are part of ambisonics, which are kind of like a 3-dimensional MS technique. So MS uses a forward-facing microphone, generally cardioid, and a side-facing bidirectional that are at the same point in space, and you can use that to steer a stereo pair. What a sound field mic does is tries to put 3 bidirectional mics. So imagine you have a forward-facing bidirectional, forward-back, a left-right facing, and an up-down facing. So that gives you your 3 directional vectors, and you put a 4th omnidirectional mic at that same point, and you can use that to make any polar pattern pointing in any direction. Physically, you can't get those 4 mics together, so that's why they do this crazy subcardioids on a tetrahedron that has to be decoded. It's completely just a coincident mic array that can be decoded to any polar pattern in any direction. But it's still coincident. So you don't get the benefits of using omnidirectionals and that great low frequency response. You don't get the benefit of any kind of spaciousness. So Carl's idea of using a bunch of them is kind of interesting because that would give you the spaciousness between several sound field mics.
Interesting. Laura Thompson of Texas says, can you pinch and zoom on the iPad Music app, maybe to change spatial orientation? Todd has his hand up.
Yes, absolutely, Laura, you can. I think I kind of answered this for her in Mukana, but I wanted to show it up close and personal. Here's the pinch and zoom moving around. And also over here on the right is a little file folder on the right. And there's even for you and for everybody who needs it, there is an accessibility. Where did it go? I saw it before. Hold on. Let me just make sure it's there. There was an accessibility option here under settings, I believe, maybe. Let me look. There it is. Yeah, there's accessibility down here in the settings under more, and I'm not exactly sure there's all sorts of stuff in there that you can take a look at. The app is called Fourscore, Forscore. It's available on iPad and on the M1 as well. Oh my goodness. Nice. There must be music going on in the background, isn't there? I was completely unaware.
Somebody's injecting something. We have 2 more questions and we're home free today. So Mark Horner of Seattle, Washington says, Todd mentioned his music. Where do I find or buy it? The title of the album, please. Thanks. Todd?
I just put a link in Mukana. The album is called Outer Borough, and there's still music. Let me get rid of it. Sorry.
It's your little ostinato to
accompany. I made a little ostinato just while I was waiting. Digifiddler.bandcamp.com. Outer Borough is the name of the record. It's 2011. That's a long time. It's its 10th anniversary this year. I think I might need to make another, or if Alex will help me, I will remix Outer Borough in spatial audio.
Let's do it. I know some people that would. I don't know if I can help you, but I know some people who could. That would be a lot of fun.
Maybe. Let's
talk
do
about
it together. It'd be fun.
Yeah, absolutely.
And our final question.
I think that was for John Barker, who's not here right now. So,
okay, so we're done.
Yeah. Thanks, Bill, for keeping things going, keeping the fire warm, and thanks to the panelists for doing a great job. I was glad that I was able to get into some of this because I was really bummed that I wasn't going to get to see this conversation. So thank you so much for.
This was a fascinating couple of
really,
hours,
really
man.
like a crazy master's course on this like little condensed version for us to think about. That's the kind of thing that I love about the Tuesdays, is that we get into these really deep audio questions. It's fantastic. So thanks to the panelists. Thanks to the producers for the great questions, Drew, that pulled it all out and made it possible. And now we're going to jump into the post show. Here we go.